What would you do if the person you helped in the rain turned out to be the one person who could destroy everything you'd spent 2 years fighting to build? Ethan Carter didn't know the answer to that question when he put $3 on a bakery counter for a stranger. I wasn't thinking about consequences. He wasn't calculating. He was just a tired father who still believed people deserved small kindnesses, even on nights when the world felt like it was swallowing him whole. He had no idea that stranger would walk into his life again the very next morning and close a door he couldn't afford to lose. If this story already has you hooked, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The rain that evening wasn't the dramatic cinematic kind. It wasn't thunder and lightning cutting across a dark skyline. It was the other kind, the miserable, indecisive kind that couldn't decide if it wanted to be a drizzle or a downpour, so it committed to both at once. The kind of rain that soaks through your jacket before you even realize you're getting wet. The kind that makes a city that already feels heavy feel heavier. Ethan Carter drove with both hands on the wheel, squinting through a windshield that his wipers couldn't keep up with. The defroster had been broken for 3 weeks. He kept meaning to get it fixed. He kept running out of days. The back seat of his 10-year-old Civic held a collapsed umbrella that hadn't opened properly since August, a half-finished coloring book, 3 of Chloe's hair ties, and a crumpled permission slip for a field trip that was now 6 days past due. He found the paper wedged under the passenger seat at a red light, stared at it, sighed. Dad of the year, he muttered to himself, and kept driving. The original plan had been simple. Go home, make dinner, help Chloe with her spelling words, get to bed at a reasonable hour. Maybe look at the Sterling Capital proposal one more time before he lost his nerve entirely. The pitch was tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. sharp, and Ethan had been preparing for it for 4 months. 4 months of revised blueprints and updated cost projections, and 3 separate meetings with his accountant, who kept gently suggesting that maybe Ethan should take on some commercial work first, build up some capital, and then pursue the housing project later. Later wasn't a word Ethan had much patience for anymore. He'd used it too many times in the last 2 years. Later, I'll deal with the grief. Later, I'll figure out the finances. Later, I'll stop waking up at 3 a.m. with the specific panic of a man who isn't sure if his business will survive the month. Later had a way of turning into never. So instead of going home, he turned left on Devereaux Street and pulled into the narrow parking spot in front of a bakery called Lena's, a place barely wider than a hallway, wedged between a dry cleaner and a cell phone repair shop, with a hand-painted sign in the window that said, "Closed at 8," and a warm yellow light that had always seemed to Ethan like a dare against the Pittsburgh dark. He needed a cupcake. Chloe's lunch tomorrow. It was a small thing, a stupid thing, maybe, given everything else weighing on him. But she'd had a rough week. Her best friend Maya had moved to Cleveland, and Chloe had been quiet in the way that 8-year-olds go quiet when something is hurting them and they don't have the words yet. A cupcake in her lunchbox was the only thing Ethan could think to do. He was 32 years old, an architect by training and trade, a man who could read structural load calculations and translate topographic surveys into human spaces. But parenting a grieving 8-year-old was its own kind of engineering, one he was still fumbling through, one blueprint at a time. The bell above the door rang as he pushed inside. The place smelled like vanilla and warm butter, and for just a second Ethan let himself breathe it in. There was a short line, 4 people ahead of him, and the warmth of the bakery hit him like something physical after the cold rain. He shook the water off his jacket, ran a hand through his hair, and took his place in line behind a man in a blue postal uniform. That was when he heard the sound. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. Just the soft, repeating beep of a card reader rejecting a transaction. Declined. Pause. Declined. The woman at the counter was probably around 30, dark coat, dark hair pulled back in a way that suggested it had started the day neat and hadn't survived. She was holding a small white box, birthday cake, from the size of it, and pressing a card against the reader like if she tried one more time, the number would somehow change. The man behind her shifted his weight. A woman in a red coat exhaled loudly. The kind of silent pressure that's somehow louder than anything anyone could say out loud. The woman at the counter, Ethan would notice this later, when he thought about the moment, didn't look panicked. She looked like someone who had already been through enough that humiliation had become just one more thing to absorb. She lowered the card, started to say something to the young woman behind the counter, started to apologize, probably. Ethan stepped out of line before he made a decision about it. He reached past the man in the postal uniform, put $3 bills on the counter, and said, quietly, not making a show of it, "Everyone deserves a birthday cake." He hadn't planned the words. They came out the way things do when you're not thinking, which meant they were probably more honest than anything he'd planned. He thought, vaguely, of his late wife Sarah, who had believed that more ferociously than anyone he'd ever known. Everyone deserves a birthday cake. She'd have said something like that. She'd have meant it the same way. The woman turned to look at him. She had dark eyes. Not the beautiful, cinematic kind of dark eyes that romance novels talked about. Just tired, real, a little red-rimmed at the edges, the way eyes get when they're trying hard not to do something embarrassing in public. She looked at him like she was trying to figure out if he was being kind or condescending, and he held her gaze just long enough to hope the distinction was clear. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was even, controlled. Someone used to keeping her voice even. "Don't worry about it," Ethan said, already stepping back into line. She picked up the box. She turned toward the door. The bell rang above her as she disappeared into the rain, and Ethan turned back to the front of the line, ordered one chocolate cupcake with sprinkles, paid with the last $7 in his wallet, and drove home. I thought about her for maybe 3 minutes on the way back. Then Chloe needed help with a splinter in her palm. Dinner burned slightly on the stove, and he was up until 11:30 making final adjustments to the pitch deck. I was in a good suit, or rather, the closest thing he owned to a good suit. Navy blue, bought 4 years ago for a project presentation in Columbus, pressed the night before, slightly too big now because he'd lost weight in the year after Sarah died and hadn't really put it back. He'd stood in the bathroom mirror for 3 minutes trying to decide if it mattered, concluded that it didn't, and put it on anyway. Chloe was eating cereal when he came downstairs. "You look fancy," she said without looking up from her bowl. "I have a big meeting today." "Will you get the project?" She'd heard him talk about Grace Harbor enough times that she'd absorbed its shape, the way kids absorb the shapes of adult worries, not fully understanding, but aware that it mattered. "I don't know yet," Ethan said, which was the most honest answer he had. Chloe considered this. Then she pushed her half-finished cereal aside, got up, walked to the kitchen counter, and came back with a yellow crayon. She drew a small sun on the corner of a napkin and slid it across the table toward him. "For luck," she said, like it was obvious. He looked at the napkin sun, looked at his daughter, all 8 years of her, completely serious, completely certain that a crayon sun was a reasonable contribution to an architecture pitch. "Thank you," he said, and meant it more than he was prepared for. He tucked the napkin into his jacket pocket, kissed her on top of her head, dropped her at school 20 minutes later, and drove toward Sterling Capital's towering glass headquarters on Grant Street. The lobby of Sterling Capital was the kind of lobby designed to remind you that you were smaller than the building. 40-foot ceilings, marble floors, a receptionist who smiled in the specific calibrated way of someone trained to be warm without being personal. Ethan signed in, clipped on a visitor badge, and rode the elevator to the 22nd floor. He'd been here once before, 3 months ago, a preliminary meeting with 2 junior associates who'd liked the project enough to push it up the chain. He knew the layout. Knew the conference room would be to the left off the elevator, the one with the long glass table and the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the Pittsburgh skyline stretched out behind it. He didn't know what he'd find inside. He set up his presentation materials, laid out the printed copies of the proposal, checked the projector connection twice. His hands were steady, which surprised him. He'd expected nerves, but what he found instead was something quieter. Resignation, maybe. Or the specific calm that comes from running out of things to fear. The door opened at 9:02. 3 board members came in first. Older men, expensive suits, the kind of polite indifference that comes from attending too many of these meetings to be genuinely curious anymore. Then 2 more. A woman with a tablet who sat near the back and didn't introduce herself. And then, the door opened again. She walked in like the room had been waiting for her, which, Ethan realized, it had. Because the room had gone slightly different. Not quieter, exactly, but more attentive, in the way that rooms do when the person who actually matters has arrived. She was in a charcoal blazer over a white blouse, hair pulled back in the same way as the night before. The same woman. The box from the bakery. The card that had declined 3 times while people stared. She took the seat at the head of the table, set a folder down, and looked up. Their eyes met. For a half-second, neither of them moved. Ethan watched her absorb the recognition, watched it move through her face with the control of someone who'd spent years learning to keep very little visible on the surface. She blinked once. Something behind her expression settled, like a lock clicking. Mr. Carter, she said, and her voice was the same measured, even tone from the night before. I'm Victoria Sinclair. I'm the CEO of Sterling Capital. Thank you for coming in. She didn't acknowledge the bakery. Not a flicker. Ethan took a breath. Thank you for having me. And he began. I was good at this part. Whatever else Ethan Carter had struggled with in the last 2 years, the grief, the finances, the particular loneliness of eating dinner alone after Chloe went to sleep, he had never struggled with talking about buildings, about space and light, and the way a structure could tell people who they were or who they could become. He believed it. That made the difference. He walked them through Grace Harbor from the beginning, the location in the Hill District, chosen deliberately because it was near transit, near schools, near the women's shelters that Sarah had worked with before she got sick. He showed them the floor plans, thoughtfully designed units where natural light was a feature, not an afterthought. Community spaces, a small learning center on the ground floor, gardens between the buildings where children could be outside safely. Affordable housing has a reputation for looking like it was designed to be endured, Ethan said. Grace Harbor is designed to be lived in. There's a difference. He watched the board members. Some were listening. Some were watching their phones under the table. One of the older men, heavy-set, silver hair, permanent expression of mild skepticism, had been frowning since approximately the third slide. Ethan kept going. He covered the financial projections. The cost breakdown. The funding gap that Sterling Capital's investment would close. The projected social return. Reduced shelter overcrowding, increased workforce stability among residents, long-term property value effects on the surrounding neighborhood. This isn't charity, he said. It's investment. The return is just measured in more than one way. He finished, set down his marker, let the room breathe. The silver-haired man, Ethan would learn his name was Leonard Graves, Senior VP, picked up the financial summary and turned it over like he was looking for something. Mr. Carter, Graves said, these numbers don't reflect your previous firm's financial history. I run an independent practice now. These projections are based on they're based on a firm with 2 full-time employees and 1 major project in the last 3 years. Graves set the paper down. No offense intended, but the board has to consider execution risk. I've built more than this proposal, Ethan said, keeping his voice level. If you look at the full portfolio, we did look at it. Graves again, cutting, practiced. What we see is a talented designer who left the industry during a personal crisis and hasn't fully returned. That's not a judgment. It's simply the question the numbers raise. There was a silence. Ethan looked at Victoria Sinclair. She was watching him with an expression that told him absolutely nothing. And somehow, that was the thing that unsteadied him most. Not Graves's dismissal, not the polite disinterest of the board members checking their phones. The fact that the woman who had stood at that bakery counter last night, accepting $3 from a stranger with tears she was fighting to keep in, was sitting at the head of this table giving him nothing. I appreciate the board's concerns, Ethan said. I'd welcome the chance to address them directly. Graves looked at Victoria. Something passed between them that Ethan couldn't read. Then Graves looked back at Ethan and said, pleasantly, devastatingly, we'll be in touch. The elevator ride down took 43 seconds. Ethan counted them because it gave him something to do with his brain while the rest of him was trying to process what had just happened. They were going to reject it. He knew it the way you know certain things before they're confirmed. In the body first, in the stomach. A cold, flat knowing that analysis only catches up to later. Graves had come in with his mind already made up. The others had followed his lead. Victoria Sinclair had sat at the head of the table and not said a word to counter it. He stepped out of the lobby into the cold November air. The rain from last night had left everything wet and gray. Pigeons huddled on the parking structure ledge across the street. A taxi went past too fast through a puddle and soaked the bottom of Ethan's pants. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Just stood there, holding his portfolio bag, in his slightly too big navy suit, water soaking into the hem of his pants. Then he got in his car. Drove back toward the office, a 2-room space above a hardware store in Lawrenceville that he shared with his 1 full-time employee, a young designer named Marcus, who had stayed with him through everything and probably should have taken a higher-paying job 18 months ago. He called Marcus from the parking lot. How'd it go? Marcus answered on the first ring. Ethan paused. Board seemed skeptical. Skeptical like we need more time, or skeptical like this is a no. I don't know yet. I'll know by end of week. Okay. A beat. You all right? Fine. You don't sound fine. I'm fine, Marcus. He hung up, sat for a second with the phone in his hand. Then he pulled out Chloe's napkin from his jacket pocket, the yellow crayon sun, slightly crumpled now from the morning, and put it flat on the passenger seat, like that counted for something. It didn't fix anything, but it made the car feel slightly less empty. He went upstairs and got to work. In the Sterling Capitol boardroom, 22 floors above Grant Street, a different kind of meeting was already underway. Leonard Graves stood at the window with his phone to his ear, while two junior executives sat very still and said nothing. Outside, rain was threatening to start again. Inside, Graves's voice was calm in the particular way that calm gets when it is actually something else wearing a calm mask. I don't care what it looks like, he was saying. The Hill District proposal dies here. We move forward with the Riverside plan. On the other end of the call, a developer named Whitfield, who had been nursing the Riverside luxury condominium project for 2 years and had found Leonard Graves to be a very useful man. There was the sound of quiet satisfaction. The financial reports? Whitfield asked. Already adjusted, Graves said. Carter's firm looks like a liability. The board saw numbers this morning that don't match the real record, and they don't know that. He paused. By the time anyone looks closely enough, the vote will be done. He hung up, walked back to the conference table, picked up Ethan Carter's proposal from the stack. Read the cover page, Grace Harbor, Affordable Housing for Families in Transition, with the expression of a man who found the title faintly amusing. Set it face down on the pile. But in the next office down the hall, through a door that had been left slightly ajar, Victoria Sinclair sat at her desk. She had heard most of it. She'd been on her way back from the restroom, had slowed without meaning to when she heard Graves's voice, that particular low controlled frequency he used when he didn't want to be overheard, which had the paradoxical effect of making her want to listen harder. The financial reports. Already adjusted. She sat very still at her desk now. Her own tea was going cold. She didn't touch it. She was looking at the wall above her computer screen, but she wasn't seeing it. She was seeing Ethan Carter in the elevator lobby this morning. The moment he'd recognized her, the exact way he'd chosen to say nothing about the bakery, the measured, steady way. He'd stood in front of a skeptical board and talked about buildings full of light for people who had nowhere else to go. She was hearing Graves's voice, already adjusted. Carter's firm looks like a liability, and she was thinking about a $3 cupcake and a napkin she'd seen fall from his jacket pocket onto the boardroom floor and how he hadn't even seemed to notice. She reached across her desk and opened the folder with Ethan Carter's original proposal. She started reading. It was the receptionist who found it, tucked under the edge of the conference table, where it had apparently slid off the seat of the chair Ethan had been sitting in. A small yellow piece of paper, obviously torn from a notepad, with a lopsided sun drawn in crayon and the word luck written underneath in the specific unsteady handwriting of someone who had recently learned that K was harder than it looked. The receptionist brought it to Victoria's assistant, who brought it to Victoria because it had come from the boardroom during the Carter meeting, and therefore it was Victoria's problem to determine what to do with it. Victoria looked at it for a long time. She turned it over. Nothing on the back. Then she put it in her jacket pocket. She didn't make a decision about it then. She just put it there, the way you put things somewhere safe when you don't know yet what to do with them. Outside, the rain had started again. Ethan picked Chloe up from school at 3:45. She came out wearing her purple backpack and a headband that had a small plastic flower on it that she'd gotten from a birthday party the previous month and had worn every day since. She got in the car, buckled her seatbelt, and then looked at him in the precise way she'd been looking at him since she was 4 years old. The direct, assessing look that had always made him feel like she could see more than she let on. "How'd it go?" she asked. "Still waiting to hear," he said. She looked at him a moment longer, then she reached into her backpack and pulled out a paper with a gold star sticker on it, a spelling test, and held it up. "I got 100, she said. "That's great, Bug." "I practiced necessary like 40 times, she said, with the specific pride of someone who has genuinely suffered for a result. "It paid off." "Do you think we can get pizza tonight?" "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I think we can get pizza tonight." She smiled, satisfied, and turned to look out the window as he pulled out of the school lot. He was glad she was 8. He was glad she could still be completely satisfied by a perfect spelling test and a Friday pizza. He drove home with both hands on the wheel and tried not to think about the phone call he was expecting by end of week. Chloe was in the bath when his phone rang. Ethan was standing at the kitchen counter, eating cold pizza out of the box and reviewing the cost analysis one more time. A habit he couldn't seem to break even when reviewing it, couldn't change anything. The number was Sterling Capital's main line. He stared at it for 2 rings, then answered, "Mr. Carter." The voice was an associate he'd met once. Professional, neutral, trained to deliver outcomes without inflection. "I'm calling with an update from the board's review of the Grace Harbor proposal." "I'm listening." A pause. Minimal. "The board has decided to pass at this time. The primary concerns relate to execution risk given the current size and capitalization of your firm. They want you to know they found the conceptual design strong, but the answer's no." "Yes, sir. I'm sorry." Ethan stood very still. The pizza was cold. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of Chloe singing something in the bath. She always sang in the bath, some mashup of a pop song and a melody she'd made up herself that didn't entirely follow musical logic, but that Ethan had come to love the way you love things that are imperfectly, stubbornly original. "Thank you for calling," he said. He hung up. He put his hands flat on the counter, stared at the kitchen tile. The mortgage payment was due in 18 days. He had 2 smaller contract projects in progress. A residential renovation in Shadyside, a commercial fit-out in the Strip District that would cover the basics for another 2 months. After that, without Grace Harbor or something like it, the math stopped working. He'd already talked to the bank once. They'd been patient. Banks had a limit to their patience. If the firm folded, the house went next. Sarah's house. The one they'd bought together, the one Chloe had grown up in, the one with the crack in the back porch step that Ethan had never fixed, but that Sarah had said gave the house character. He stood at the kitchen counter for 3 minutes while Chloe sang in the other room. Then he washed his hands, dried them, walked to the bathroom door, and knocked. "Almost done?" he said. "2 more minutes." "Okay, 2 minutes." I went back to the kitchen, put the pizza away, started the dishes. He didn't cry. Not then. He'd learned, in the last 2 years, to put things somewhere he could get to them later, when Chloe was asleep, when the house was quiet, when there was no one watching who needed him to be okay. He was good at that now. Good at the delay. Whether that was healthy or not was a question he'd tabled for later. Probably also later. He washed a bowl. Washed a glass. Stacked them on the drying rack. Outside, it started to rain again. It rained often. This was something Ethan had always known, had even found endearing once, in the way you find a city's particular textures endearing when you love the city. Pittsburgh in November was a specific shade of gray, layered, with a cold that got into the bones differently than winter proper. Not brutal yet, just persistent, reminding you it was coming. Sarah had loved the rain. She'd had a specific thing about it. Cleansing, she used to say, which had made Ethan roll his eyes affectionately, because it was exactly the kind of thing Sarah said that was both a little corny and completely sincere. She'd meant it. She'd stand at the kitchen window and watch the rain fall on their small backyard and look entirely at peace. He thought about her now. He thought about her at strange angles, not in the way of grief manuals, not the expected moments, but in mundane interruptions. At the kitchen window, driving past the hospital she'd been treated at on Fifth Avenue, and noticing he'd gone 3 weeks without noticing it anymore. Finding one of her pens in a kitchen drawer, completely ordinary, just a blue pen, and having to sit down for a minute. She had spent the last year of her life working with a shelter called Sunrise House, 2 afternoons a week, helping women coming out of crisis situations write resumes and navigate housing applications. She'd done it from a wheelchair some days, when she wasn't strong enough to sit upright at a desk. She had never once mentioned that it was hard. Grace Harbor had been his version of continuing that conversation, his way of saying, "I heard you, I'm still listening," and now the board had said no. And Leonard Graves had something to do with why, though Ethan didn't know that yet. He finished the dishes, checked on Chloe, out of the bath, pajamas on, sprawled across her bed reading a book about horses. He sat on the edge of her bed and they talked for 20 minutes about nothing in particular. Horses, her spelling test, whether pizza counted as a vegetable because it had tomato sauce. Probably not, Ethan said. But tomatoes are a fruit, Chloe argued, so technically it's healthier than a vegetable. He laughed, actually laughed, which surprised him slightly. That logic has some real holes in it. Name one hole. Go to sleep, Bug, she groaned. He kissed her forehead, turned out the light, and left the door slightly open the way she liked it. Then he went to his desk, opened the laptop, and stared at the Grace Harbor files. He didn't delete them. I wasn't sure what that meant yet. But he wasn't deleting them. Ethan was at Lena's bakery at 7:15 a.m. because it had become, somewhere in the last 6 months, The only quiet place he had that didn't come with responsibilities attached. He'd been coming 2 or 3 mornings a week when he could manage the timing before Chloe's school run. He'd order coffee and whatever was fresh out of the oven, sit at the small corner table by the window, and have 30 minutes that belonged entirely to him. That morning, he was 3 days into a revised plan. Smaller, scaled down, self-funded through a combination of creative accounting and a conversation with an old colleague in Cleveland who might be able to bring in private investors. It wasn't the same as Grace Harbor, but it was something to work on, and working on something was better than sitting still with the alternative. He was reading over preliminary notes when the bell above the door rang. He didn't look up. Then he heard a voice order a black coffee, and something about the cadence of it, the particular measured evenness, the way it was polite without being warm, made him look. Victoria Sinclair. She was in a long wool coat, dark gray, and she was looking at the pastry case with the careful attention of someone who had come in with a specific purpose and was delaying it. She glanced up, found him across the small room. She didn't hesitate this time, picked up her coffee, and walked directly to his table. "May I?" She nodded toward the empty chair. Ethan looked at her for a moment. "You're not here for the coffee." "No," she said simply. She sat down, reached into her coat pocket, set something on the table between them. Chloe's napkin. The yellow sun. He stared at it. Something moved through his chest that he didn't quite have a word for. Not grief exactly, not tenderness exactly, something in between. "She left it in the boardroom," Victoria said. "I should have had someone mail it, but She stopped. "I thought I'd return it myself." "Thank you," Ethan said. He picked it up, turned it over. The crayon had smudged slightly at one corner. There was a silence. The bakery was quiet, 2 other customers at opposite ends of the small space, Lena moving behind the counter. Then Victoria Sinclair put both hands around her coffee cup, looked at him, and said, "Tell me about Grace Harbor, the real version, not the pitch." Ethan looked at her. "You rejected it," he said. "I know I did." "So why?" "Because I think I made a mistake," she said, "and I don't usually admit that easily, so I'd appreciate it if you just started talking." He sat back, studied her face. The same controlled surface from the boardroom, but with something underneath it now. Something that looked, if he was reading it right, like genuine unease, like a woman sitting with the discomfort of a decision that hadn't settled right. He looked out the window for a moment. The street was wet. A bus went by. Then he started talking. He told her about Sarah first. Not the way he told it in proposals. Not the professional shorthand, "My late wife worked with shelter organizations," but the actual version. About who Sarah Carter had been, how she'd argued with him the first time they met at a university lecture in their 3rd year of architecture school, because he'd said that aesthetics and affordability were mutually exclusive at scale, and she'd found that profoundly wrong and told him so in front of 40 people without any apparent self-consciousness. "She was right," he said. "Obviously. I was 21 and hadn't built anything yet." What did she do? After school? She wanted to go into urban planning. Then Chloe came along, and Sarah had this thing about she didn't want to be a planner who never actually touched the communities she was planning for. So she stayed closer to home, volunteered, worked with Sunrise House 2 afternoons a week. He paused. She was better at the human side of it than I ever was. And when she died, I stopped. For about a year, I basically stopped. He said it plainly, without drama. I kept the business running on autopilot. I raised Chloe. I functioned. But the part of the work that actually meant something, I couldn't get to it. It felt like it was behind glass. Victoria was quiet, just listening. He'd noticed that about her, that she actually listened, not in the way of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but in the way of someone genuinely collecting what was being said. "Grace Harbor was the first time in 2 years I felt like I was doing the real thing again," he said. "Building something Sarah would have recognized, not just putting up walls." He stopped, looked down at his coffee cup. "I don't usually say all that in a pitch meeting." "No," Victoria said. "You didn't." "Would it have changed anything?" She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Maybe. I'm not sure. The board makes collective decisions, and Graves carries weight on the funding committee." She hesitated, and Ethan noticed the hesitation, the way her jaw tightened slightly before she continued. "I have some concerns about how the decision was reached." He looked at her directly. "What kind of concerns?" "The kind I can't discuss here." She said it quickly, and then looked away toward the window, as if she hadn't meant to say that much. A silence. "Ms. Sinclair," Ethan said slowly. Victoria. Victoria. If there was something wrong with how that decision was made, I need to know. She looked back at him. The controlled surface again, but he could see the calculation behind it. How much to say, to whom, for what reasons. He recognized the look. He'd worn it himself often enough. Give me 3 days, she said. Can you do that? He didn't know what he was agreeing to. But he looked at this woman, who had driven to a bakery at 7 in the morning to return a child's drawing, who had asked him to tell her the real version, and he said yes. She nodded once, stood, picked up her coffee. Your daughter's drawing is good, she said. She's got instinct for composition. Ethan looked down at the yellow sun on the table. She's 8. So? Victoria said. And for the first time, just briefly, just for a second, there was something that might have been a smile. Not quite there, but approaching. Then she walked out into the wet Pittsburgh morning, and he watched her go. He sat for a long time at the small corner table. The napkin with the yellow sun was in his hand. He didn't know yet what Victoria Sinclair had heard in the hallway outside Leonard Graves's office. He didn't know about the altered documents, the scheme, the luxury development waiting to take Grace Harbor's place. He just knew that something had shifted, and that it was raining again, and that for the first time in a week, the weight on his chest felt like something that might eventually move. 3 days. That was what Victoria had asked for. Ethan had agreed to it without knowing exactly what he was agreeing to, which was unlike him. He was a man who liked to understand the terms of things before signing on. But there had been something in the way she'd said it. Give me 3 days. Not a request dressed up as a request. Just a straight line between what she needed and what she was asking for. He'd driven home from the bakery that morning and told Marcus there might be new information coming on Grace Harbor. Marcus had looked up from his monitor with the particular expression he reserved for things he didn't quite believe but wanted to. Like what kind of new information? He'd asked. I don't know yet, Ethan said. Just don't delete anything. Marcus stared at him. I wasn't planning to delete anything. Good, don't. He'd gone back to the Shadyside renovation files and tried to concentrate, with limited success. He kept returning to what Victoria had said. I have some concerns about how the decision was reached. And then the hesitation, the jaw tightening, the way she'd looked away fast like she'd said more than she meant to. It wasn't naive. He knew corporations moved the way they moved, and the reasons a proposal got buried were rarely the reasons they gave you. He'd been in the industry long enough, but knowing something was possible and having it confirmed were different weights to carry. He wasn't sure which one he was carrying yet. The 3 days passed with the particular slowness of days you're wading through. He took Chloe to her Wednesday piano lesson, during which she played the same 12-bar section of a simplified Beethoven piece 6 times, while her teacher, Mrs. Okafor, maintained a composure Ethan genuinely admired. He made grocery runs. He sat with the Shadyside renovation blueprints until he was actually seeing them again instead of just looking at them. Thursday night, he fell asleep on the couch with his laptop open and woke up at 2 a.m. with a crick in his neck and Chloe's yellow crayon napkin sitting on the coffee table where he'd left it, the little sun looking up at him in the dark. He put it back in his jacket pocket. He wasn't sure when it had become a habit, but there it was. Friday morning, his phone showed a text from a number he didn't have saved. Can you meet at 6 p.m.? Not the office. Lena's. He stared at it for long enough that Chloe called from upstairs asking why breakfast wasn't ready. He texted back one word, yes, and went to make eggs. He found a sitter for Chloe, a neighbor's college-age daughter who Chloe tolerated on the condition that she be allowed to pick the movie, a negotiation Ethan had long ago stopped trying to influence. He arrived at the bakery at 5:50. Victoria was already there. She was in a corner booth rather than a counter seat, which told him this was a longer conversation than last time. She had a folder in front of her. Not a company folder, just a plain manila folder, the kind you bought at CVS. She had a cup of tea that looked untouched and cooling. She was wearing a dark blue sweater instead of a blazer, and it was the first time Ethan had seen her in anything other than the architecture of professional clothing, and something about it made her look both younger and more tired at the same time. He sat down across from her. She pushed the folder to the center of the table but didn't open it yet. Before I show you this, she said, I need you to understand that I didn't know. About any of it. Her voice was even. It was always even. But underneath it, for the first time, he could hear something that sounded like it cost her something to say. Okay, he said carefully. I mean that. She looked at him directly. I'm not saying it to protect myself. I'm saying it because what I'm about to show you is going to make you angry, and I need you to know the shape of what happened before you decide what to do with it. Ethan put both hands flat on the table. Show me. She opened the folder. The documents were printed on plain paper. Copies, not originals. She'd been careful about that, clearly. The first page was a financial summary that Ethan recognized immediately. His firm's projected revenue and capitalization figures, as presented in the Grace Harbor proposal. He'd looked at these numbers so many times he could have recited them from memory. But the numbers on this page were different, not dramatically different, not crudely falsified. They were the kind of different that required someone who knew what they were looking at. A subtle suppression of the projected revenue figures, a selective omission of 2 prior project completions that would have demonstrated consistent delivery capacity, a reclassification of his current contract work that made it appear provisional rather than confirmed. Whoever had done this knew how to alter financial documentation in a way that looked like interpretation rather than fabrication. The kind of thing that, if challenged, could be defended as a matter of perspective. We were being conservative. We were accounting for risk. The kind of thing that was designed to be exactly difficult enough to disprove that most people wouldn't bother. Ethan sat very still. He turned the first page over, read the second, then the third. The third page was an internal email thread, again, printed on plain paper, no headers, the company metadata stripped. But the content was clear enough. Leonard Graves, writing to someone identified only by initials, DW, about the Hill District proposal. The language was careful, the way you get careful when you know you're writing something down. But the intention was not. The Carter proposal doesn't survive the funding committee if the numbers reflect a marginal firm. Adjust accordingly. The Riverside development needs that allocation. Ethan read it twice. Then he put it down on the table. The bakery was quiet. Someone had put on a low record behind the counter, something old, something with a trumpet, and the sound floated between them without quite filling the space. Graves did this, Ethan said. It wasn't a question. Yes. He altered my financial documentation before it reached the board. Yes. And the board voted based on the altered figures. Yes. Victoria paused. Most of them didn't know. They saw numbers that told a story of a marginal firm with execution risk. That's what they voted on. She hesitated. That's what I voted on. He looked up from the documents. She was watching him with the specific expression of someone who has made the decision to not look away from something uncomfortable, even when it costs them. You heard him, Ethan said. In the hallway. Part of it. What did you do? I went back to my office and pulled your original submission from the archive. The version you sent before it went through Graves's committee review. She nodded toward the folder. The differences are on pages 4 and 5. I compared them line by line. He turned to page 4. She'd marked the discrepancies in pencil. Neat small marks, not highlighting, because highlighting was harder to explain away. If this ended up in front of people, it shouldn't be in front of. He saw what she'd marked. He saw the gap between what he'd submitted and what the board had seen. His jaw tightened. He'd been sitting at his kitchen counter eating cold pizza when they'd called to reject him. He'd stood there in his slightly too big suit and made his case and gotten destroyed by numbers that were not his numbers. He'd driven home. He'd washed the dishes. He'd talked about pizza with his daughter. How long has Graves been doing this? He asked. I don't know. This is the first time I've... She stopped. Reset. I've had concerns about Graves for a while. The Riverside development has been pushing for a long time. I knew he favored it. I didn't know he'd crossed into falsification. And DW? Whitfield. Daniel Whitfield. He's the principal developer behind Riverside. He and Graves have a relationship that predates my tenure at the company. She said it carefully, the way you say things when you're not sure how much you can prove and how much is inference. I'm still building the full picture. Ethan sat back, looked at the ceiling. The trumpet record kept playing behind the counter, something slow and mournful that fit the conversation in a way he wasn't sure he appreciated. What do you want from me? He asked. I want to fix this, she said, but I need to know you're in agreement on how. He looked at her. In agreement on how? Meaning you have a plan. The beginning of one. What does the beginning of one look like? She folded her hands on top of the folder. She had the posture of someone who spent a lot of time in rooms where she had to establish authority quickly. And even now, in a corner booth in a small bakery, it was there. Not aggressive, just upright, present. There's an emergency board meeting scheduled for Monday, she said. Graves called it. He wants to move the Riverside development forward through an accelerated approval. If that vote passes, the funding allocation that Grace Harbor needed goes with it, probably permanently. Monday, Ethan repeated. 2 days from now. He looked at the documents, at the altered figures, at the pencil marks Victoria had made, precise and careful, like someone who knew this might need to hold up somewhere. And if I walk into that boardroom Monday with you, he said, then we make the case in front of everyone with the original documentation and the evidence of what was changed, together. She paused. It's riskier than going through legal channels first. Slower routes give Graves time to get ahead of it. He's good at getting ahead of things. And what's the risk for you? She was quiet for a moment. He'll call it a betrayal. He'll say I'm destabilizing the company for a personal agenda. He has allies on the board. Another pause. He may try to remove me. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. At this woman who had, 3 days ago, gone to a bakery at 7 in the morning to return a child's crayon drawing, who had then gone home and spent her weekend going through archived documents and printing comparison pages with pencil marks. You've been CEO for how long? He asked. 14 months. How old are you? She blinked slightly. 31. He nodded slowly, said nothing. What? She asked. Nothing, just... He exhaled. 14 months in, and you're taking on a senior executive with board allies and a property developer in his pocket. I'm not doing it because it's smart, she said, and there was the first real edge in her voice. Not anger exactly, but something sharper than the controlled surface she usually maintained. I'm doing it because those documents have my name on the approval chain, because I voted to reject something I should have protected, and because... She stopped herself, looked down at the folder. When she looked back up, the edge was still there, but quieter. Because it's the right thing to do. That's really the whole reason. I was quiet. Outside, a car went past slowly through rain that had started again while they were talking, its headlights sweeping across the bakery window and over both of them for a second, then gone. I'll be there Monday, Ethan said. She nodded. Then she slid a business card across the table. My direct line. Not the company switchboard. If anything changes before then. He picked it up, looked at it. Victoria Sinclair, Chief Executive Officer, Sterling Capital. He put it in his pocket, next to where he usually kept Chloe's yellow sun. One thing, he said. She waited. I'm not going in there Monday to ask for anything, he said. I'm not going to stand in front of that board and pitch Grace Harbor again, like nothing happened. If we're going in to put the truth in front of the room. What the board does with it after that is their problem. She looked at him steadily. Agreed. He stood up, picked up his jacket from the seat beside him. Then he paused. The night at the bakery, he said. The birthday cake. She went very still. It wasn't yours, he said. It wasn't a question. He'd been thinking about it on and off since that morning. The careful way she'd carried the box. The way she'd pressed the card against the reader like she could will the number to change. My assistant, she said. She was working late that night, her birthday, her 3rd year at the company. She was embarrassed to ask for early release. She stopped. It was going to be a surprise. He nodded, said nothing else about it. Good night, Ms. Sinclair, he said. Victoria, she said. Victoria. He zipped his jacket, walked to the door. The bell rang above him as he pushed out into the rain. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Then he pulled out his phone and called the sitter to say he was on his way. I didn't know if Monday would work. He didn't know how many allies Graves had, or what the board would do when the thing was laid out in front of them, or whether any of it would be enough. He knew how these things could go. He'd watched the industry long enough to know that people with power and long histories in a company had ways of surviving exposure that defied reasonable expectation. But he thought about the documents with the pencil marks. He thought about a woman who had spent her weekend in her apartment going through archived files because she'd voted wrong and wasn't willing to let it stand. He got in his car and drove home. When he got back, Chloe was still awake, technically, in the sense that she was horizontal in bed with her eyes closed and her book still open on the pillow beside her. He stood in the doorway for a moment. She'd fallen asleep with the small bedside lamp still on, its warm yellow light making the room look like an illustration in a children's book. The rumpled blanket, the scattered stuffed animals, the open book with its pictures of horses. He turned off the lamp, picked up the book, set it on the nightstand. He looked at her for a moment in the dark. Then he went to his own room, sat on the edge of the bed, and thought about what he was walking into on Monday. He thought about Sarah, too. Not sentimentally, or not only sentimentally, more like a consultation. Sarah had been better at confrontations than he was. She'd had a directness that he'd always admired and occasionally found terrifying, a willingness to say the true thing in a room of people who were pretending the true thing wasn't there. She'd never been cruel about it. She'd just been clear. There are families waiting for homes, he thought. That was what he'd say Monday. Whatever happened with Graves, whatever the board decided, whatever Victoria's position was at the end of it, that was the thing that couldn't get lost. The reason the thing existed, the families waiting. He set his alarm. Lay down in his clothes for a while before getting up and actually changing. Outside, the rain had slowed to the indecisive kind again, tapping against the window without commitment. He slept badly and woke up feeling clearer than he had in a week. The weekend passed in the practical business of living. He took Chloe to a birthday party Saturday afternoon, one of her classmates, a chaos of 8-year-olds in a community center gymnasium with streamers and a cake that was aggressively purple. He sat with the other parents along the wall and talked about nothing in particular, the pleasant, shallow conversational water of people who know each other primarily through the fact of their children. He was grateful for it. It was easy in a way the week hadn't been. Sunday. Marcus came over to the apartment and they sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours going through the original Grace Harbor documentation. Every figure, every projection, every delivery timeline. If Monday went the way Victoria thought it might, Ethan wanted to know every number cold. He wanted to stand in front of that board and have the real figures so completely in his head that there was no question which version was true. Marcus spread the pages across the kitchen table and watched Ethan work through them with the attention of a man who had been an architect for 6 years and had spent half of it watching Ethan half disappear and come back. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said at one point. "You're going to either way. This Sinclair woman, the CEO." Marcus kept his voice neutral but didn't quite succeed. "You trust her?" Ethan looked up from the page he was reviewing, thought about it honestly. "I think she's trying to do the right thing," he said. "Whether that's the same as trusting her, I don't know yet. That's careful." "Yeah." Marcus nodded. "You want me there Monday?" "No," Ethan said. "I need you here. If something goes sideways, I need someone who knows the project well enough to keep it moving." "If something goes sideways," Marcus repeated with the tone of someone filing the phrase away. "Just know the numbers," Ethan said. "All of them." Marcus looked at the spread of documents across the kitchen table. "I know them," he said quietly. "I've known them for 2 years." Ethan looked up. Marcus was looking at the pages with an expression that Ethan recognized. The same expression Marcus had worn the night they'd both stayed until midnight, finalizing the proposal before submission. The expression of someone who'd put more of himself into something than could be explained by a paycheck. "Thank you," Ethan said, and meant it the way he meant things when the words weren't quite adequate. Marcus just nodded and turned back to the documents. That night, after Chloe was in bed, Ethan sat at his desk and wrote something, not a speech. He didn't do speeches, just notes. What he wanted to say, what he needed the board to understand. He didn't write it to be impressive. He wrote it to be true. He read it back once, changed 2 words, folded the paper, put it in his jacket pocket alongside the business card and the yellow crayon sun. Monday arrived the way Mondays did. Without ceremony, without any particular indication that it was going to be different from any other Monday, which Ethan had always found to be the particular cruelty of important days. The morning was ordinary. Breakfast, school drop-off, the usual negotiation about whether Chloe needed her rain jacket or whether she'd be fine. She lost the negotiation. She always did. He parked in front of Sterling Capital at 8:45. Sat in the car for 2 minutes. Not paralyzed, just present. Just taking stock of the fact that he was about to walk into a room where the outcome was genuinely uncertain, carrying evidence of fraud against a man who had more institutional power in that building than he did, alongside a CEO who might not have her job by the afternoon. He thought about the families, the women and children who didn't exist yet in Grace Harbor, because Grace Harbor didn't exist yet, who were in shelters and temporary housing and places that didn't have the light Sarah had always believed people deserved. He got out of the car. Victoria was waiting in the lobby. She was in a black blazer and dark slacks, dressed for a fight, or at least for the professional version of one. She had a leather portfolio under her arm and the same controlled expression that he'd stopped reading as coldness and started reading as something else. The specific composure of someone who needs to stay sharp in rooms that run on pressure. She looked at him. He nodded once. "Board's already seated," she said quietly. "Graves got here early. He's been talking." "Talking to who?" "Everyone he could get to before we arrived." Her voice was measured, but he could hear the edge of it. "He knows something is coming. He doesn't know exactly what." "Does that change anything?" It means we can't let the room get loud before we've shown them the documents. She paused. Once they see the documents, let it get as loud as it wants. They walked toward the elevator together. Neither of them said anything else. The elevator opened on 22, and they walked toward the conference room, and Ethan could hear voices inside before they even reached the door. The low collective rumble of a room full of people waiting for something to begin. Victoria paused at the door, just for a fraction of a second. He saw it. The tiny check, the breath she took and let go, the moment before. Then she opened the door and walked in. Ethan followed. Leonard Graves was at the far end of the table, in a gray suit, already talking to a man on his left. He saw Victoria first, a quick flicker of something, assessment, recalibration, and then he saw Ethan Carter, and the flicker became very still. The room went quieter. "Victoria," Graves said pleasantly, the pleasantness of a man establishing territory. "I wasn't aware we had a guest today. Mr. Carter is here in his capacity as the architect of the Grace Harbor proposal," Victoria said, setting her portfolio on the table. Her voice was absolutely even, absolutely calm. A woman who had spent the weekend deciding exactly how to walk into this room. "Given what I've uncovered this week, I asked him to be present for this meeting." Graves tilted his head slightly. "And what exactly have you uncovered? I think we should let the board see it first," she said, "before we have that conversation." She opened her portfolio. She began placing documents on the table. And Ethan Carter, who was not a man who made speeches, stood beside her and waited for the room to understand what it was looking at. Whatever happened next, and things were about to get very loud very fast, had started with a rainy night and a $3 cupcake and a woman who had stood at a bakery counter trying to hold herself together while a line of impatient strangers stared at her back. It had started, really, with a small act done for no reason except that it was the right thing to do, which, as it turned out, was the same reason they were both standing here now. The first document Victoria placed on the table was the altered financial summary. She set it down without commentary. Just put it there, face up, in the center of the long glass table where everyone could see it. Then she placed the original alongside it, side by side. The differences visible to anyone who looked. Nobody looked. Not yet. They were still watching Graves. Graves had not moved from his chair. He was doing the thing Ethan had watched powerful people do in difficult rooms, staying very still and letting the stillness work for him. His hands were flat on the table. His expression was faintly confused, the careful performance of a man who wasn't confused at all. "Victoria," he said, and his voice had the particular patience of a man explaining something to someone who didn't quite understand the room they were in. "We called this meeting to move the Riverside approval forward. Whatever you found that you feel needs discussion, I'm sure there's a better venue than—" "The figures presented to this board during the Grace Harbor review were altered," Victoria said. She said it the way you pull a bandage. Fast, clear, no preliminary wince. The financial summary Mr. Carter submitted showed a firm with confirmed contract revenue, 2 successfully delivered projects in the prior 18 months, and capitalization adequate for the proposed scope. The summary the board reviewed showed none of that. One of the board members, a woman named Patricia Huang, who Ethan had noticed earlier, mid-50s, sharp eyes, the expression of someone who processed information quickly, leaned slightly forward. "What do you mean, altered?" Huang said. "I mean, the numbers are different." Victoria slid the 2 documents toward the center of the table. Not interpretation, not rounding. Different figures, different project history, different revenue classification. Pages 4 and 5 show the comparison. The room did a thing rooms do when the temperature changes. A collective adjustment, not quite movement, just a shift in attention. 2 board members reached for the document simultaneously. A third pulled out reading glasses. Graves watched this happen with an expression Ethan couldn't entirely read. Not panic, not yet, but something that had stopped being comfortable. "I want to be clear about what I'm accusing and what I'm still establishing," Victoria continued. She stood at the side of the table, not at the head, deliberately, Ethan thought, not claiming the authority position, but the factual one. The documents were altered between submission and committee review. That review is Leonard's committee. I have an internal email that establishes communication between Leonard and Daniel Whitfield about the outcome of the Grace Harbor vote. She paused. I also have evidence that the Riverside development, Whitfield's project, was positioned to receive the allocation that Grace Harbor needed. The room went genuinely quiet. Not the quiet of shock, exactly. The quiet of people recalibrating. Graves stood up. He didn't raise his voice. That was what Ethan noticed first, the complete absence of raised voice, because raising it would have been a concession. Instead, Graves stood up with the controlled deliberateness of a man who'd been in difficult rooms before and knew exactly how much composure was worth. "This is an extraordinary accusation," he said. He was speaking to the room, not to Victoria, turning slightly, addressing the board members the way a lawyer addresses a jury. "I've spent 11 years building this company's investment portfolio." 11 years. "And I'm now being presented, without any prior notice, with what amounts to an allegation of fraud in front of the full board based on a document comparison assembled by a CEO with 14 months of tenure." He paused, and the pause was calculated. "I'd like to know what's really driving this." "Leonard," Victoria started. "No." His voice was still even. "I'm going to ask the question that everyone in this room should be asking. What is Victoria Sinclair's relationship to Ethan Carter? Because I find it interesting that she's asked him to stand in this room this morning. And I find it interesting that this accusation comes precisely when I've assembled the votes needed to move a legitimate development project forward." He looked around the table. "I'd like the board to consider the possibility that what we're looking at is not a fraud investigation. It's a disruption." "Yeah." A beat. Then another. Ethan watched the faces around the table. He watched Patricia Huang turn the comparison pages slowly, reading with genuine attention. He watched two of the other board members exchange a glance. He watched one man, older, heavy-set, who hadn't moved or said anything, watching Graves with an expression that was careful in a way that wasn't neutral. Ethan stood at the edge of the room. He'd said nothing yet. He hadn't moved since they'd walked in. He'd watched the board receive the documents, watched Graves stand up and do what skilled corporate operators did when cornered, which was to turn the accusation around and aim it back. It was working, a little. He could feel it. The slight tilt of the room, the hesitation that came with Graves's long history in the building versus Victoria's short one, the specific doubt that powerful men cultivated in rooms like this. The suggestion that this was personal, that it was motivated, that the woman with 14 months of tenure was overreaching. Ethan thought about Sarah in the wheelchair on Tuesday afternoons. He thought about the housing application forms and the resumes and the women who needed someone to sit across from them and say, "Your situation has a next step." He thought about Chloe's yellow sun on the napkin. Then he thought, "No, not a speech, not a pitch. Just the true thing," said plainly. He stepped forward. "Can I say something?" The room turned to look at him. Graves turned to look at him. The turn was slow and deliberate, the physical language of a man who had just realized he'd been leaving a variable out of his calculation. "Mr. Carter," Graves said pleasantly, "you're a guest in this room. I'm not sure the board has—" "He was invited," Victoria said. Flat, leaving no room. A pause. Graves settled back slightly. The board watched. Ethan didn't look at his notes. He'd put them in his pocket this morning and left them there, because the words he'd written down Saturday night were just the real thing anyway. And he could say the real thing without paper. "I'm not here to pitch the project again," he said. "I already did that. The board voted on information that wasn't mine. I want to say that plainly, not as an accusation. The documents show what they show. The board can decide what it means." He looked around the table, not performing, just looking at people. "What I want to say is that there are families, women and children, who have been on housing wait lists for years. Some of them are in shelters right now. Some are in situations that are worse than shelters. Grace Harbor would give them something specific, stable, decent housing that was designed to be a place to live, not a place to wait. My wife spent the last year of her life working toward that. She's gone. I'm still here, and I'd like the board to know that when it makes this decision, it's not making a decision about me or about Victoria Sinclair or about Leonard Graves. It's making a decision about whether those families get that housing or whether they don't." He paused. "That's all I wanted to say." He stepped back. The room was very quiet. Graves looked at him for a moment with an expression that was the first uncontrolled thing Ethan had seen on his face all morning. Not fear exactly, but something close to the recognition that the ground had shifted under him in a way he hadn't accounted for. Then Patricia Huang set the comparison pages down on the table and said, "Leonard, I need you to explain to me specifically why these two revenue figures are different." And the room, which had been hovering, landed. What happened next was not clean. Ethan had seen enough of the world to know that things were almost never clean, and this was no exception. Graves did not confess. He did not crumble. He was too experienced for that, too practiced in the art of the long institutional fight. What he did was pivot, away from the specifics of the document comparison, toward the procedural question of whether this was the appropriate venue, toward the personal and professional, toward the framing that this was a destabilization effort by a chief executive trying to neutralize a challenge to her authority. I was good at it. Ethan had to give him that. There was a 20-minute stretch during which two of the board members seemed genuinely uncertain, not about whether the documents were different, which was right there in front of them, but about what it meant and who had done it, and whether the right interpretation of all of it might still somehow favor Graves. But Patricia Hong kept asking specific questions, and the man in the corner, the quiet one who hadn't moved, turned out to be Wallace Chen, the board's independent auditor representative, and he was not going to let the procedural argument stand. He said, with the specific efficiency of a man who had spent 40 years cutting through the noise of precisely this kind of room, the question before us is not about venues. The question is whether these documents were altered, and whether that alteration affected a board vote. If the answer to both is yes, then we have an obligation to address it. Everything else is secondary. Graves looked at Chen. Chen looked back at him with the expression of a man who'd been neutral for a long time and had just stopped being neutral. I'd like to call for a formal suspension of the Riverside vote, Chen said, pending a full audit review of the Grace Harbor submission and the committee process. Seconded, Patricia Huang said immediately. A show of hands. Ethan counted, 5-3, with Graves and two of his closest allies opposed. Graves sat down slowly. Victoria said, "The motion carries." Her voice was steady, completely steady. Ethan was watching Graves when she said it, watching the moment the calculation shifted behind his eyes. The moment a man who was very good at playing long games understood that the ground had moved beneath him in a way he might not be able to move back. Graves looked at his hands on the table. Then he looked at Victoria with an expression that had lost all of its pleasantness and all of its performance and was just something else, something older and colder. "You should understand," Graves said quietly, to her specifically, in a voice that didn't carry to the whole room, "what this costs you." "I understand exactly what it costs," Victoria said, and she held his gaze without flinching, which Ethan thought took more than most people would have given her credit for. The meeting ended 40 minutes later with a second motion, a formal suspension of Graves's funding committee authority pending the audit. He left the room without another word, flanked by the two allies who'd voted with him, the door closing behind them with a sound that was conspicuously ordinary for how much it meant. The remaining board members gathered around the table in the slightly shell-shocked way of people who had just watched something they'd thought was solid turn out not to be. Patricia Huang shook Ethan's hand with a firmness that surprised him. "I knew Sarah Carter," she said, and then seemed to decide that was enough, because she moved on without elaborating. Ethan didn't ask how, he just nodded. Wallace Chen stopped next to Victoria on his way out. "The audit will take approximately 3 weeks. You'll want legal involved from day one." "Already scheduled," Victoria said. Chen looked at her for a moment. "You did the right thing," he said, with the blunt simplicity of a man who didn't give compliments as a professional habit. Then he left, and then the room was empty except for the two of them, standing beside the long glass table with the Pittsburgh skyline behind them. Gray day, low clouds, the city going about its business 22 floors below. Victoria put both hands on the back of a chair. She exhaled. It was the first time since they'd walked in that Ethan had seen her do anything that could be described as unguarded. "That could have gone worse," he said. "It could have gone much better," she said. "Could it?" She considered. "No," she admitted. "Probably not." He picked up the documents from the table, the originals, which she'd let him keep, and squared them against the glass surface. His hands were steady. He was faintly surprised they were, but there it was. "Graves meant what he said," he told her, "about what this costs you." "I know." "The two who voted with him, will they be a problem?" "Almost certainly." She straightened up from the chair back. "But the audit creates a formal record. Once that's in motion, it's harder to quietly undo things. Chen makes sure of that." "And Whitfield? Once the audit pulls the committee communications, Whitfield's involvement will be visible. His lawyers will advise him to cooperate with the investigation rather than get pulled into the center of it." She said it with the efficient certainty of someone who had been running calculations for days. "He has more to lose than Graves does." Ethan nodded. Then after a moment, "What happens to Grace Harbor now?" Victoria looked at him. The project goes back before the board with the original documentation. Clean process. No graves on the funding committee. The timeline sets back by a month, maybe 6 weeks. She paused. The vote will be different. You're sure? I'm not sure of anything, she said, and it sounded honest in a way he appreciated. But the project is what it is. The original documents show a viable proposal. The board will vote on the real numbers. She picked up her portfolio. That's all you ever needed. He held the folder with the documents. The comparison pages with the pencil marks. The evidence that someone had decided his work wasn't worth the trouble of honest evaluation. I'm sorry, Victoria said. He looked up. For the vote, she said. I know that's insufficient. I know you've lost time and... She stopped. I'm sorry. He looked at her for a moment. She was watching him with the specific expression of someone who meant the apology and wasn't sure it would land. It's not your fault, he said. I was in the room. So was I, he said. Different side of the table. He paused. Thank you for the pencil marks. She blinked. Then something happened at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but its precursor, the expression before the expression. The pencil marks, she repeated. They held up. They did, she agreed. He picked up his jacket from the back of a chair. I'll wait for the audit results. It'll be 3 weeks, maybe 4. I've waited longer. He said it matter-of-factly, without drama, and she heard what was behind it. 2 years of waiting, of working from behind glass, of functioning while the real thing waited for him to be able to reach it again. She walked him to the elevator. Not because it was required, just because she did. They stood in the elevator lobby while he pressed the call button. One question, he said. Go ahead. The bakery. That morning, before the pitch. You came at 7 a.m. to return a drawing that could have been mailed. She said nothing. And then you spent a weekend going through archived documents. Still nothing. And then you walked into a boardroom on 2 days' notice and put your job in front of a problem that had nothing formally to do with you. It had everything to do with me, she said. My name was on the approval chain. Partly, he said. What's the other part? The elevator opened. He looked at her. She was looking at the middle distance, the specific look of someone deciding how honest to be. My father was a contractor, she said finally. Small business. He spent 3 years developing a proposal for a city redevelopment project. Someone in the procurement office wanted the contract to go somewhere else. His numbers got reclassified as non-compliant. He never found out why. She paused. He folded the business the following year. I was 12. A beat. So when I see someone's financial documents altered to make a viable proposal look like a liability, she stopped, looked at him directly. I couldn't not do something about it. That's the other part. He held her gaze. I'm sorry about your father, he said. It was a long time ago, she said, in the tone of someone for whom it was not entirely a long time ago. The elevator stood open, waiting. Thank you, Victoria, Ethan said. She nodded once. He stepped in. The doors closed. He rode down 43 floors, he didn't count them this time, and walked out through the lobby into the cold Pittsburgh afternoon. He sat in his car for a moment without starting it. I thought about what she'd said about her father, the contractor, the reclassified numbers. 12 years old, watching a business fold for reasons no one could explain clearly. He thought about the specific distance between that 12-year-old and the woman who had stood at the head of a boardroom table this morning and not flinched when Leonard Graves said, "You should understand what this costs you." People were constructed out of the things that had happened to them. That wasn't a revelation, just a fact. But it always caught him slightly off guard when he saw the specific shape of it in someone else. The moment when the surface cracked just enough to show you what was underneath, what had been there all along. He started the car, drove to Marcus's office. Marcus heard the door open and spun his chair around. He looked at Ethan's face. Well, he said. Audit's been called, Ethan said. Graves is suspended from the funding committee. The project goes back before the board in 4 weeks. Marcus stared at him. You're serious? Yeah. Marcus stopped, shook his head. Then, Victoria Sinclair? Victoria Sinclair. Marcus sat back in his chair and blew out a long breath. He looked at the ceiling. Then he looked back at Ethan. What happens in 4 weeks? We find out if the real numbers are enough. Are they? Ethan sat down in this chair across from Marcus's desk. He thought about Patricia Huang turning the comparison pages slowly. About Wallace Chen saying the question is whether these documents were altered. About the quiet shift in the room once the specific factual question got asked, and Graves couldn't answer it. I think so, he said. Yeah, I think so. Marcus nodded. Then he said, I kept the files. I know you did. I kept all of them, Marcus said, with the emphasis of a man who wanted credit for a decision he'd made before he knew it mattered. Marcus, I'm just saying. I know. Thank you. Ethan leaned back. The chair creaked. He was tired in the specific deep-seated way that came after sustained tension released. Not exhausted, just emptied out. We need to have the full revised proposal ready in 2 weeks, in case the audit moves faster than expected. Marcus was already turning back to his monitor. Already started it, he said. Last Friday. Ethan looked at the back of his head. When did you start it? When you told me not to delete anything, Marcus said without turning around. That's when I knew. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, We should probably talk about your salary. Probably, Marcus agreed, still not turning around. But let's get the project funded first. That night, Ethan picked Chloe up from the neighbors and drove home through traffic that moved slowly because it was Monday evening, and Pittsburgh traffic on Monday evenings moved slowly, and the whole ordinary specific world was going on exactly as it always did, regardless of what had happened in a boardroom on the 22nd floor. Chloe spent the whole drive telling him about a situation at school involving a dispute over who had actually won a foursquare game, a dispute that had apparently fractured the fourth-grade social landscape with impressive thoroughness. Ethan listened. He asked follow-up questions. He was genuinely interested, which still surprised him sometimes. How much he genuinely cared about the details of his daughter's life, even the ones that had no weight outside of the world of 8-year-olds. Maybe especially those, after dinner, after homework, after the small evening routines that had become the architecture of their life together. He sat on the back porch in the cold with a cup of coffee, on the step with the crack that gave the house character. He thought about Leonard Graves going home to whatever Leonard Graves went home to, carrying the knowledge that an audit was coming and the board had shifted and the long game had gotten complicated. He thought about Victoria Sinclair in her apartment, somewhere in the city, somewhere with a window probably, because she seemed like a person who needed windows, with the folder of comparison pages, and the 3 weeks ahead of her and the 2 board members who were going to be problems. He thought about Grace Harbor, the floor plans still on his desk, the community spaces, the gardens, the light he'd designed in, deliberately, room by room, because Sarah had been right about that too. That light wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity, and designing it as an afterthought was a choice that said something about what you believed people deserved. The city was out there beyond the fence. The houses of his neighborhood, lit up in the evening, each one someone's version of a life. The cold November air smelled like damp leaves and exhaust, and something cooking from 3 houses down. He drank his coffee. He sat with the outcome, which wasn't a resolution, not yet, not for weeks still, and felt, for the first time in longer than he could cleanly remember, like the thing he'd been pushing against had moved. Just a little. Just enough to know it could. Then he went inside, washed his cup, checked on Chloe. Asleep, her book on the nightstand, her horse-patterned blanket pulled up to her chin. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He pulled the folded napkin from his jacket pocket. The yellow sun, the crayon-smudged corner. He set it on her nightstand beside the book. He turned out the light and went to bed. In 3 weeks, the audit would come back. In 4 weeks, the board would vote again. Between now and then, there was work to do. The revised proposal, the Shady Side renovation, the Strip District fit-out, the mortgage payment coming up in 11 days. The ordinary machinery of a life that didn't stop for dramatic moments. But tonight, on the back step in the cold with the crack that gave the house character, something had settled. Not fixed, not finished, just settled. And for now, that was enough to sleep on. The audit took 22 days. Ethan knew this because he counted them, not obsessively, but the way you track things that matter, the way you check the weather before a trip you've been planning for months. Not because checking changes anything, but because it gives your anxiety somewhere to go. He worked. He kept his head down and worked. The Shady Side renovation moved into its final phase. The Strip District fit-out hit a problem with the HVAC subcontractor that cost 4 days and a significant amount of Marcus's goodwill. Ethan paid the mortgage with 3 days to spare, which was either a victory or a near miss depending on how generous you were feeling about it. He didn't hear from Victoria during those 3 weeks. Not directly. Marcus had a contact at Sterling Capital, a junior associate named Priya, who had done a semester internship with their firm 2 years back and still occasionally sent Marcus links to architecture competitions. And through Priya, they got the shape of what was happening inside the building, if not the details. The audit team had been given full access to committee records. Legal was involved. Two of Graves' support staff had been reassigned. The Riverside development had gone formally quiet, which in corporate language meant it had died without anyone announcing the funeral. What Priya couldn't tell them was what was happening to Victoria. Ethan thought about her more than he probably should have, given that thinking about her didn't change the audit timeline and he had actual work in front of him. But he thought about her the way you think about someone who has done something genuinely costly on your behalf, and you're not sure yet how to account for it. She'd put her position in that room. She'd stood in front of a board that was still partly Graves's board and laid out the evidence and held her ground when Graves turned it around. She'd done that for reasons that were hers. The contractor father, the reclassified numbers, the 12-year-old who watched a business fold. But she'd also done it for a project she'd voted against and a man she'd met in a bakery during a rainy Tuesday. I wasn't sure what to do with that. So he worked and waited and paid the mortgage and took Chloe to piano lessons and let the 22 days pass. On the 23rd day, a Wednesday, his phone rang at 8:15 in the morning while he was making school lunches. The number was the direct line from the business card. The audit came back, Victoria said. Clean documentation of the alteration, full committee communications, including the Whitfield correspondence. The board received the report last night. He put down the knife. And? Emergency meeting this afternoon. Graves's attorney has already been in contact with the board's legal team. A pause. He's not going to fight the suspension. He's negotiating terms for a separation. Meaning he's done. He's done, she confirmed. Ethan leaned against the counter. The kitchen was ordinary around him. Chloe's cereal bowl, the permission slip he'd actually remembered to sign this time, the morning light coming in through the window. He'd stood in this kitchen 11 days ago and told himself it would be enough to just have the thing move. He'd been right, mostly. But hearing it said plainly was different. The board wants to schedule the Grace Harbor review for 2 weeks from today, Victoria said. Clean process. Wallace Chen is overseeing the funding committee personally until a replacement for Graves is named. 2 weeks, Ethan said. Can you have everything ready? It's already ready. Has been for 10 days. A pause on her end. Something that might have been a breath of relief, or might have been the connection. Good. Victoria. He hesitated. Are you okay? Your position... Patricia Huang called me last night, she said, and her voice was carefully even in the way it got when she was containing something. She said the board's confidence in my leadership has been affirmed by the way I handled the situation. Another pause. That's corporate language for you're not getting fired. He almost laughed. Almost. How do you feel about it? I feel like I need to sleep for approximately 4 days, she said, and then I'll feel fine. That's honest. I'm very tired, she said, and it came out unguarded in a way that he'd learned to notice, the moments when the controlled surface dropped, not because she chose to let it, but because there was simply nothing left to hold it up. It's been a long 3 weeks. Yeah, he said. It has. A silence. Comfortable somehow, despite being a phone call between two people who had known each other for less than a month. 2 weeks, he said again. 2 weeks, she confirmed. I'll have the meeting details sent over by end of day. He hung up, stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then he said, Marcus, even though Marcus wasn't there, just to say it to someone. Then he called Marcus. It's time, he said when Marcus picked up. Marcus said, I know, Priya texted me 20 minutes ago. Of course she did. The proposal is ready. I pulled the final version last night, actually, because I couldn't sleep and I needed something to do with my hands. It's ready? It's ready, Marcus said, and there was something in his voice, not pride exactly, but close to it, the specific satisfaction of a man who had put real work into something and was about to find out if it mattered. Then we wait 2 weeks, Ethan said. We wait 2 weeks, Marcus agreed. Those 2 weeks were different from the 22 days of the audit. Calmer, somehow, but with a different quality of waiting. Less anxious, more careful, the way you handle something breakable, not because you're afraid of it, but because you respect what it is. Ethan ran through the proposal until every figure was automatic. He walked Marcus through each section until Marcus could have given the presentation himself, which was the point. If anything happened to Ethan between now and the vote, the project didn't die with his presentation. On the second Thursday of that stretch, Victoria called again. Not about the project, about something smaller. I have a question, she said, and the slight awkwardness in her voice was the first time he'd heard her sound something other than composed. Okay. Chloe. Her drawing. The sun. A pause. How old did you say she was? 8. Does she draw often? Constantly, he said. Every available surface. I've given up protecting the craft paper, and I just let her use whatever's nearby. What is she like, besides horses and spelling tests? He stopped. How do you know about the spelling test? A beat. You mentioned it, in the bakery, briefly. He thought back. He might have. He'd talked a lot that morning, told her things he hadn't told anyone in a while, and some of the smaller details had probably come out in between the larger ones. He found that he didn't mind. Why are you asking about Chloe? He said. Not suspicious, just curious. I found a children's art supply set, she said, and then spoke slightly faster, the cadence of someone who has rehearsed and then decided to abandon the rehearsal. A good one. Not the cheap kind. I was going to send it, but then I thought that might be strange, so I'm asking first. Ethan looked at the wall for a moment. He was standing in his office above the hardware store, and the light through the window was the flat gray of a Pittsburgh November afternoon, and Victoria Sinclair was on the phone asking if it was strange to send art supplies to his 8-year-old daughter. It's not strange, he said. You're sure? She'd love it, he said. She'd use every single thing in it within 48 hours and then ask for more. A pause. Then, quieter. Does she know about the project, about what happened with the board? She knows there was a problem and that it might be fixed, he said. I told her things got complicated, but we were still trying. I don't give her the full adult version of things. That's good, Victoria said. She stopped. Then, she must be resilient, given everything. She is, he said. She's also 8, so resilience and stubbornness look exactly the same, and I can't always tell which one I'm dealing with. Victoria laughed. It was brief and genuine and slightly surprised-sounding, as if she hadn't intended it, and he thought it was probably the most unguarded thing he'd heard her do. Send the art supplies, he said. She'll write you a thank you note. Fair warning, her handwriting is still a work in progress. I don't mind, she said. He didn't know what to do with the way that conversation sat in him afterward. He wasn't ready to examine it too closely, so he didn't. He filed it in the same place he filed other things he wasn't ready for yet, and got back to work. The art supplies arrived on Friday, a proper set, watercolors and colored pencils, and a thick pad of good paper. And Chloe opened the package with the specific intensity she brought to anything unexpected and new. She spread everything out on the kitchen table and spent 3 hours that afternoon painting something large and multicolored that defied description. Who sent this? She asked. Someone who heard you were a good artist, Ethan said. Chloe considered this. Is it the lady from your work? He looked at her. What lady from my work? The one you were on the phone with. You sound different when you talk to her. She said it with the offhand certainty of a child reporting a simple fact, already moving on to choosing between the cobalt and the navy. Ethan said, Sound different how? Chloe shrugged elaborately, like you're paying attention. He didn't have an answer for that. He made dinner. The board meeting happened on a Tuesday, which Ethan thought was appropriate. The whole thing had started on a Tuesday, in the rain, at Lena's, and there was something fitting about the axis of it. He wore the navy suit again. He'd had it properly fitted this time, finally, 2 weeks back, at a tailor in Squirrel Hill, who had looked at it and said something diplomatic about the importance of shoulders. It fit now. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror and thought it was the kind of difference that probably only mattered to him, which was fine. Chloe looked up from her cereal and said, You look better in that than last time. The tailor helped. You should have done it before. Thank you, Bug, he said, with the resigned tone of a man receiving accurate criticism from an 8-year-old. Good luck, she said. Then she went back to her cereal. He drove to Sterling Capital, parked in the same spot, sat for 1 minute, not 2, then went inside. The lobby was the same 40-foot ceilings, the same calibrated warmth at the reception desk. But the atmosphere on 22 was different, quieter, in a way that felt intentional rather than incidental. Graves had cleared his office the previous week. Priya had told Marcus, who had told Ethan, and the absence of a man who had occupied a space for 11 years apparently had a specific quality to it, a rearrangement of the air. Victoria was in the conference room when Ethan arrived, speaking quietly with Wallace Chen. She looked up when he came in. She was in a deep green blazer today instead of the charcoal or the black, and the color did something different to her face, warmer, less armor. He wasn't sure if it was deliberate. Mr. Carter, Chen said, extending a hand. Good to see you. Mr. Chen, thank you for what you did in the last meeting. I did what the audit process requires, Chen said, with the crisp modesty of a man who didn't take credit for doing his job, but wasn't going to pretend the job hadn't mattered. Let's make sure this one goes the way it should. The board filed in over the next 10 minutes. Patricia Huang arrived second, nodded at Ethan with the acknowledgement of someone who remembered where they'd last left a conversation. Two of the faces were new, replacements for the men who'd been most closely aligned with Graves, brought in to fill the funding committee gap. One of them, a woman named Dr. Sandra Park from the university's urban development faculty, introduced herself to Ethan before the meeting started and said she'd reviewed the proposal over the weekend. The community learning center on the ground floor, she said. Tell me more about how you envisioned the programming. And they were off. The conversation he'd been wanting to have for months. The real one. The one about how a building worked as a community rather than just as a structure. He talked about it standing at the edge of the room while the other board members arrived, and Dr. Park listened the way Victoria listened, collecting rather than waiting. The meeting itself was shorter than he expected. That was the first thing. The formal presentation took 35 minutes. He'd cut it down from the original pitch, stripped the defensive parts, kept the essential core. The who, the what, the why, the numbers. Clean, unadorned. The real version that he'd described in Lena's that morning in November, sitting across from a woman who'd asked him for it. Wallace Chen ran the funding committee review with the methodical precision of a man who had been ensuring that rooms like this one arrived at accurate conclusions for 4 decades. He walked the board through the corrected financial figures. He presented the audit findings. He answered questions directly, without the hedging language that usually characterized these reviews, and the board received it that way. The questions were different this time, not skeptical, analytical. Dr. Park asked about the delivery timeline. Patricia Huang asked about the community management model for common spaces. A third member asked about the construction partnership strategy, and Ethan answered with specific names and previous project records. The information he'd had all along, the information that had been buried in the altered summary. There was one difficult moment. One of the original members, an older man named Forsyth, who hadn't been aligned with Graves but hadn't been against him either, raised the execution risk question again. Not maliciously, just cautiously, the caution of a man who genuinely needed to be satisfied. Mr. Carter, Forsyth said, your firm is small. 2 employees. The scope of Grace Harbor is significant. How do we feel confident that... I managed a 30-person team before I reduced my practice, Ethan said. I reduced it for personal reasons, not professional ones. The capacity to expand for this project is in the contract structure. I've already had preliminary conversations with 3 sub-firms in Pittsburgh, one of which did the Hill District Community Center 2 years ago. Their principals are prepared to come in for a formal interview with the board at your request. He paused. I'm not asking you to take that on faith. I'm telling you it exists and offering to demonstrate it. Forsyth nodded slowly. That would be useful, yes. Then we can schedule it, Victoria said from the head of the table, and Forsyth nodded again. The vote happened at 11:47 a.m., 8-0. Chen announced it with the same flat efficiency he brought to everything, but Ethan saw his expression as he said it. The tiny compression at the corners of his eyes that was the equivalent, in Wallace Chen, of a wide smile. Patricia Huang started clapping, which wasn't something that happened at board votes typically, but once she started 2 others joined in, and then it was just a thing that was happening, and Ethan stood at the front of the room and felt something move through him that he didn't have clean language for. Not relief, or not only that, something more like the sensation of a door opening that had been stuck for a very long time. He thought of Sarah, not with the knife edge of acute grief, but with the specific warm ache of someone you wish was there for a moment, that would have mattered to them. She would have said something exactly right. She always did. He looked across the room at Victoria, who was watching him with an expression that had let its guard down completely for once. Genuinely happy, he thought, in a way that she didn't seem to wear often, or easily. The happiness of someone who wasn't used to things going right and hadn't quite integrated it yet. He nodded at her. She nodded back. The formal paperwork took another hour. Contracts, approvals, signatures, the bureaucratic body of a decision that its soul had already made. Victoria walked him through each document personally, which was not standard protocol, but which she apparently decided was necessary. She sat beside him at the conference table and explained each clause with the specific precision of someone who had read it 3 times before this meeting. This one gives you complete creative control over design and material specifications, she said. pointing to a section on page 7. No committee override on aesthetic decisions. He looked at it. That's unusual. I wrote it in, she said simply. He looked at her. The project exists because of what you brought to it, she said, not what the board wanted it to be. The design should reflect that. She said it matter-of-factly, not like a gift, more like a correction of something that had been wrong. He signed the page. At the end of the packet was one final section, an offer letter, formally presented, for a senior development director position within Sterling Capital. He'd been expecting it. Victoria had mentioned it was coming as part of the board's way of formalizing the relationship. He read it carefully. The title, the compensation, the scope of authority. He put the pen down. I can't take this, he said. Victoria had been closing her folder. She stopped. I know you're going to tell me you need to keep your own practice. I promised Chloe I'd be home by 4, he said. That's part of it. But mostly, this project needs to be mine. The moment I'm an employee of the organization funding it, the integrity of the design decisions changes. He looked at her. I've seen it happen. Good architects become good employees, and then the building that gets built is not the building that was designed. Grace Harbor needs to be the building that was designed. She was quiet for a moment. He couldn't tell if she agreed or was deciding whether to push back. I could make the position a consulting arrangement, she said finally. Retained, not employed. You'd have formal standing in project reviews without the employment constraint. That I could consider. Then consider it, she said, and there was the slight corner-of-mouth expression again, the smile that wasn't quite there yet. He left Sterling Capital at 1:15, called Marcus from the parking lot. 8-0, he said. The sound Marcus made was not something Ethan could describe in words. It was the sound of 2 years of held breath releasing all at once. Then Marcus said, I need a minute, and Ethan could hear him setting the phone down. He sat in the parking lot and let Marcus have the minute. When Marcus came back on, his voice was steady again. What do we do first? Call the sub-firms, set up the formal interviews for next week, and then... Ethan paused. Pull out the construction schedule, the real one, the one with actual start dates. The one I've been keeping updated for 8 months because I refused to believe this was over? That one, yeah. Already open, Marcus said. I had it open before I answered the phone. Ethan drove home. He picked Chloe up from school at 3:45, on time, which lately had been harder than usual, and which felt, today, like a specific kind of rightness. She came out in the purple backpack and the flower headband, and she got in the car and buckled her seatbelt and looked at him. Well, she said. They said yes, he said. Chloe looked at him for a moment with the careful attention she'd had since she was 4. Then she said, Can we get ice cream? We can absolutely get ice cream. The good place, not the gas station. The good place, he agreed. They got ice cream. They sat in the car outside the shop eating it because it was too cold to sit at the outdoor tables, and the shop was too small to eat inside comfortably. Chloe had strawberry. Ethan had coffee, which Chloe considered a waste of ice cream potential and said so. Coffee is a legitimate flavor, he said. It tastes like morning, she said disapprovingly. I like morning. She considered this, decided it was not worth arguing about, and went back to her strawberry. After a minute, not looking up, she said, Is the lady going to come to our house? He looked at the side of her face. She was watching a pigeon on the sidewalk with the intense focus she brought to animals. What ladybug? The one who sent the art supplies, she said, as if this were obvious. I want to show her what I made with them. I was quiet for a moment. I don't know yet, he said honestly. Chloe nodded, satisfied by the honesty. Okay, tell her she can. He drove home and made dinner, and after Chloe was in bed, he sat at his desk and opened his laptop and looked at the Grace Harbor files. Not to revise, just to look at them. The floor plans. The community spaces. The light. He thought about calling Victoria, and then decided a text was better for tonight, less demanding. Board vote finalized. Contract signed. Thank you, for all of it. He watched the cursor for a moment after he sent it. Then he put the phone face down and went back to the floor plans. The response came 20 minutes later while he was still at his desk. I know, I was in the room. Then a moment after, Chloe's painting arrived in the mail today. She must have sent it herself. He stared at his phone. Then he texted back. What? She addressed it to the art supplies lady at the big building on Grant Street. The mailroom called me to the lobby. A pause. Then, it's of a house with a very large sun. I'm going to assume the sun is structural. He looked at the ceiling. Then he laughed. actually laughed, for the second time in a week, in the specific, unguarded way that only happened when something was genuinely funny rather than politely so. "The sun is always structural with her," he texted back. "Good," she wrote. "I put it on my office wall." He sat with his phone and looked at the screen for a moment. Then he set it down and went back to the floor plans. The weeks that followed had the quality of things finally moving in the direction they were supposed to move. The subfirm interviews went well. The principals from the Hill District Community Center project came in and made exactly the impression Ethan had hoped for, and Wallace Chen shook hands with all three of them with the specific approval of a man satisfied by due diligence. The construction schedule was finalized. The site survey team went out to the Hill District location on a cold Thursday, and Ethan stood on the corner watching them work, his breath visible in the air, looking at the piece of land that was about to become something. Victoria came to the site survey. Not officially. She was there in her long gray coat, without an entourage or a schedule, standing slightly apart from the team and looking at the lot with an expression Ethan couldn't read from 10 feet away. He walked over. They stood beside each other looking at the same piece of land. "You didn't have to come out here," he said. "I wanted to see it," she said. "The actual ground." She paused. "It's different from a floor plan." "Always is." She looked at the empty lot. At the streetscape around it, the school 2 blocks north, the transit stop at the corner, the community grocery that had survived the neighborhood's economic shifts and was still there, still open. She'd done her own research on the location, he understood. She probably knew the transit schedule and the school enrollment numbers and the block-by-block vacancy rate. "It's the right place," she said. "Yeah," he said, "it is." They stood in the cold for a while. The survey team moved across the lot with their equipment. A kid on a bicycle went past on the sidewalk. Somewhere a few blocks away, a dog was barking with the unfocused persistence of a dog that had forgotten why it started. "My assistant got the birthday cake that night," Victoria said. He turned to look at her. "She cried a little," Victoria said. "She's not a crier. She was embarrassed about it." A pause. "She asked me last week who the man was. I told her I didn't know at the time." "What did she say?" "She said that was a good thing that happened," Victoria said. "Very simply, like that. Just, that was a good thing that happened." He looked back at the lot. "Yeah," he said, "it was." The cold was genuine now, November deep in its bones, and his breath and hers were both visible in the air, separate, the same temperature. Somewhere in his jacket pocket was the yellow crayon sun, creased now from weeks of carrying, the paper soft at the folds. He didn't take it out. He just knew it was there. Victoria pulled her coat tighter. Neither of them moved to leave. The survey team worked across the empty ground, measuring the space where walls would be, where windows would go, where light would eventually fall in the specific deliberate way of something designed to matter. Ethan looked at the corner of the lot where he'd put the community garden in the plans. He thought about the women who would sit there, the children who would run the paths between the plantings, the Tuesday afternoons, the resume forms, the housing applications, the ordinary specific work of giving people a next step. He thought about Sarah briefly, warmly, without the knife edge, the way it was getting easier to do. "I heard you," he thought. "I'm still here." The survey team called something across the lot, and he raised a hand to acknowledge it. Time to get to work. He glanced at Victoria. She was already looking at him. "Ready?" she said. "Yeah," he said. "Let's go." Construction began on a Monday in early February, which meant the ground was frozen, and the crew had to use industrial heaters to get the first footings poured, and the whole operation looked on that first morning considerably less cinematic than Ethan had imagined it over the previous 2 years. There was mud. There was a compressor that broke down before 9 a.m. There was a delivery of rebar that arrived 2 hours late and had to be restacked because someone had loaded the truck wrong. Marcus stood at the edge of the site in a hard hat, slightly too large for his head, and kept a running list of problems on his phone with the specific focus of a man who had decided problems were just the material of forward motion. Ethan stood at the corner where the community garden would eventually be and watched the crew work and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. The specific, grounded satisfaction of a thing that had existed only in his head and on paper beginning to exist in the physical world. Architecture was like that, and he'd missed it. Not the drawing, not the calculations. He'd kept doing those. But this, the morning when the ground finally opens and you understand that the idea is going to become weight and volume and light, that it is going to be real. He took a photo of the site with his phone. Nothing dramatic, Just the frozen ground and the crew in their yellow vests and the Pittsburgh winter sky above it, flat and white. He sent it to Victoria with no caption. She texted back 12 minutes later. How does it feel? He thought about that for a moment. Then he wrote, like it's actually happening. Because it is, she wrote back. He pocketed his phone and went back to work. The months that followed were not a montage. That was what Ethan would have told you if you asked him later what the construction period was like. It was not a clean sequence of progress shots and satisfying milestones. It was 5 days of good forward motion followed by a week of supply chain problems. It was a structural engineer who found a discrepancy in a load calculation on the third floor and cost them 11 days while the design was reviewed and the fix was implemented. It was a dispute with the city's permitting office over the community garden's irrigation system that required 4 meetings, and the patience of someone who had more patience than Ethan naturally possessed. It was also Marcus bringing breakfast sandwiches to the site on cold mornings and leaving them in the trailer for the crew without announcement. It was Dr. Sandra Park from the Sterling Board visiting the site in March with 3 of her graduate students and spending 2 hours asking questions that made Ethan think about his own design choices differently, which he appreciated even when it was uncomfortable. It was Chloe, one Saturday in April when Ethan had no sitter, sitting in the site trailer doing homework at the folding table while he reviewed submittals, occasionally looking up to ask questions about concrete that he answered honestly and that she absorbed with the equanimity of a child who had grown up around the language of building. Why does it have to be that kind of concrete? She asked at one point, pointing at a spec sheet. Because it's stronger in compression, he said. What's compression? It's what happens when something gets pushed down on from above. She thought about this. Like when I sit on my backpack? Exactly like that. She nodded, satisfied, and went back to her spelling words. He went back to the submittals. The site trailer smelled like coffee and sawdust and the particular cold of an uninsulated temporary structure in a Pittsburgh spring, and it was one of the better Saturdays he could remember in a while. Victoria came to the site regularly, but not in the way of an executive conducting oversight. She came the way someone comes to something they're invested in, without an agenda, without a team, usually on her lunch hour, in the gray coat, standing at whatever point the structure had reached that week, and looking at it with a focused attention that Ethan had come to recognize as her particular form of engagement with the world. She didn't ask to be shown around. She asked questions when she had them, and she had good ones, not about the specs, but about the intent. Why this window placement? Why the courtyard open north instead of south? Why the learning center entrance faced the street instead of the interior? He answered them the way he'd answered her in the bakery that first morning when she'd asked for the real version, directly, without the pitch language, just the thinking behind the thing. One afternoon in late April, standing on the second floor deck, with the framing up around them and the Pittsburgh skyline visible through the open wall where a window would eventually be, she said, "The light comes in exactly the way the drawing showed it." "It usually does," he said, "if you get the calculation right." "Does it always feel like this when it works?" He looked at the light coming through the framing. Golden hour light, the specific kind that only lasted 20 minutes before it changed into something else, laying across the rough plywood floor in long rectangles that would, in 6 months, fall across finished hardwood and the feet of people who lived here. "Not always," he said. "Sometimes you get the calculation right and it still doesn't feel like anything. The math is correct, but the soul of it didn't land." He paused. "This one landed." She was quiet for a moment, then, "Because of what it's for, partly. And because—" He stopped. Tried to find the right words, which was always harder with the things that actually mattered. Because it was almost something else, almost luxury condominiums that didn't need to exist. And it's not that. And that gap, between what it almost was and what it is, I feel that every time I'm on this site. She turned to look at him. The light was on her face at that angle, and she looked younger and more tired and more herself than she did in the Sterling Capitol conference rooms. And he'd noticed this about construction sites. They had a way of making people honest, something about the rawness of the materials, the visibility of the process. Nothing was finished yet. Nothing was dressed up. It was just the bones of a thing, and you either believed in the bones or you didn't. He believed in the bones. He thought, standing there, that she did too. He didn't say any of that. He turned back to the window opening and watched the light change, and they stood in a comfortable silence that had become, over the months, their particular mode. Two people who talked substantively when there was something to say and didn't fill the space when there wasn't. What was growing between them was neither of them's first priority to name, which was part of why it grew the way it did. Not toward drama or declaration, but toward something quieter and more durable. The accumulation of shared context, the specific trust that came from having been in a difficult room together and held your ground. She'd seen him at his most stripped down, sitting in the corner of a bakery with Chloe's yellow son, waiting for a phone call that was going to hurt. He'd seen her in the bakery the night before, pressing a card against a reader 3 times while people stared. They'd both seen each other under pressure and neither had found the other lacking. That mattered. Ethan was old enough to know it mattered more than most things. But he was also a man who moved carefully with things he couldn't afford to break. And what he had right now. Grace Harbor rising steel by steel above the Hill District. A daughter who was starting to thrive in ways that felt genuine rather than compensated. A business that had found its footing. Was more than he'd had at the lowest points of the last 2 years, and he was not going to rush anything in a way that put it at risk. So he didn't rush. And neither did she. There were dinners. That was the truth of it. The plain, undramatic truth. They had dinner 3 times between February and May, each time at a restaurant neither of them had suggested particularly, meeting the way people meet when they've stopped needing a pretext but haven't yet established a habit. They talked about the project and then, gradually, about other things. Her early years at Sterling, which had apparently involved a level of institutional resistance she described with the dry economy of someone who had processed it fully and moved on. His years before Chloe, the projects he'd done in his 20s when he was good at his work, but didn't yet understand why the work mattered. The specific experience of being in your early 30s and feeling simultaneously older than you expected and less prepared than you'd assumed. I thought by 31 I'd have things more figured out, she said at the third dinner. They were at a small Italian place in Lawrenceville, and she was eating pasta with the unself-conscious appetite of someone who had been in back-to-back meetings since 8 a.m. and genuinely needed to eat. What kind of things? The big ones. She gestured vaguely with her fork. Whether I'm doing the right work. What I actually want. Whether, I don't know. Whether the way I've been living makes sense. What do you mean, makes sense? She looked at her plate for a moment. I've been very focused, she said carefully. Since I was about 23, I've been very focused on the career, the position, the next step. And I've been good at it. I got where I was trying to get. She paused. And then you put $3 on a counter for my assistant's birthday cake, and I stood in the rain outside the bakery and thought, I've been in this city for 3 years, and I don't know a single person who would have done that for me. He looked at her. Not because people are unkind, she said quickly, just because I've kept things very professional, very boundaried. She set her fork down. That's not a complaint, it's just what I noticed. He was quiet for a moment. What did you do with the cake? He asked. She blinked. What? When you got to the office, with the cake. She almost smiled. I put it on Sophie's desk, my assistant. I left a note. She texted me from the elevator, completely flustered, convinced there'd been some kind of mix-up. But she kept it? She kept it. The almost smile became the real one. She ate the whole thing, she told me later, in her car, before she came up. Good, he said. It was good, she agreed. Then after a moment, she said it was the best birthday she'd had in years. He nodded. He thought about Sophie eating birthday cake in her car, and Victoria at her desk not knowing how to receive the thanks, and the 20 feet of distance between those 2 facts that represented something real about the life Victoria Sinclair had been living. He didn't point it out. He just let it sit, the way some true things needed to sit before they became useful. They walked back through Lawrenceville after, in the mild May evening, and she pointed out a building on Penn Avenue that had good bones and terrible window placement, and he agreed, and they talked about it for a block and a half, and it was easy in a way that he'd stopped taking for granted, the specific ease of talking to someone who was actually interested in the same things you were interested in. At the corner where their routes diverged, she said, Chloe's piano recital is Friday. He stopped. She mentioned it to you? She texted me. Victoria said it with the careful neutrality of someone not sure how the fact would land. From your phone, I think. The contact came up as Dad Work Lady. He put his hand over his face briefly. I'm sorry. Don't be. She looked at him with the expression he'd started to think of as hers specifically, the one that wasn't quite guarded and wasn't quite open, the one that was just her, looking at something and deciding what it meant. She asked if I was coming. What did you say? I said I'd try. A pause. Can I? Without it being, yes, he said, simply. You can. She came to the recital. She sat in the second row of the school auditorium alongside other parents and grandparents and assorted siblings who were being variably well behaved, in her gray coat, looking slightly out of context in the way that someone looks when they're somewhere they haven't been before but have decided they want to be. Chloe played her piece, a simplified Chopin that Mrs. Okafor had pushed her toward over Chloe's initial resistance, on the correct theory that Chloe was ready for it, even if Chloe didn't know that yet. She made one mistake in the middle section, corrected it, and kept going without the visible self-correction that some kids did, the wince and restart. She just kept going, and the piece landed, and the auditorium applauded. Chloe looked out from the stage and found Ethan first, then Victoria, and the expression on her face was not surprise. She'd known Victoria was coming, but something else. Satisfaction, maybe. The satisfaction of a plan that had worked. After, in the lobby, Chloe walked directly to Victoria and said, "Did you see the part in the middle where I fixed it?" "I did," Victoria said. "Most people don't notice." "I noticed. That's because you pay attention," Chloe said, with the authority of a verdict, and then moved on to the cookies table, leaving Victoria standing slightly stunned in the lobby. Ethan came to stand beside her. "She's been watching you," he said. "I know," Victoria said. She was still looking at where Chloe had gone. "She's been watching me since the first time I came to the apartment." "First time you came to the apartment?" "In March, when we went over the construction contract revision." She glanced at him. She pretended to be doing homework at the kitchen table. She had the same worksheet open for 45 minutes. He thought about this. "I had no idea." "She's subtle about it," Victoria said, and the corner of her mouth was doing the thing again, the precursor. "She's 8, but she's subtle. She gets that from her mother," he said. Said it simply, without the particular weight that mentioning Sarah used to carry with it. Not because it hurt less, but because the hurt had found its proper place. Not at the surface of every mention, but deeper, where things go when you've made room for them. Victoria looked at him. She understood the distinction, he thought. She was good at those. "She would have liked the project," Victoria said. "Yeah," he said. "She would have loved it, actually. She would have shown up at the site every week with coffee for the crew and opinions about the courtyard planting." Victoria smiled. Not the almost smile. The real one, full and brief and unguarded. It changed her face in a way he'd come to think about more than was probably useful. "Come on," he said, "before Chloe eats all the cookies, and we have to explain that to someone." She laughed, and they went. The federal investigation into Leonard Graves and Daniel Whitfield was announced in late June, which Ethan learned about from Marcus, who learned about it from Priya, which was the supply chain through which most of their sterling capital information still traveled. The investigation covered the committee communications, the fraudulent document alteration, and a pattern of bid manipulation in 2 earlier developments that the audit had uncovered as a secondary finding. Whitfield had apparently cooperated with investigators, which had the effect of accelerating the process significantly. Ethan read the news article about it once, thought about Graves sitting across the conference table saying "no offense intended," in a voice that made it clear offense was entirely intended. Thought about the altered financial figures and the cold pizza and standing at the kitchen counter while Chloe sang in the bath. He closed the article and went back to the Grace Harbor submittals. I wasn't carrying bitterness about it, or not much. He'd examined his own feelings on the subject with the honesty of a man who knew that bitterness was expensive and he couldn't afford expensive right now. What he felt was something more like, it happened, it's over, and the building is going up anyway. The building was going up anyway. That was the part that mattered. What he didn't expect was the morning in July when Victoria called him from the parking lot of Sterling Capital, and her voice was doing the carefully even thing that meant something was wrong. "I need to tell you something," she said, "before you hear it from somewhere else." He stopped walking. He was on the Hill District site, halfway across the courtyard. The summer heat was real, the crew moving around him with the focused economy of people used to working in it. The steel was up. The floor decks were poured, the building was starting to look like a building. "Tell me," he said. "The board met yesterday afternoon," she said. "They've approved an expansion of the Grace Harbor model. 3 additional sites across Pittsburgh, same design parameters, same community model." A pause. "They want you to lead the design for all 3. He stood in the middle of the courtyard. Above him, the second-floor window openings let in the July light in the rectangles he'd calculated, exactly as they should. That's good news," he said. "There's more." Her voice was still careful. "They've offered me the chairmanship of the full urban development portfolio. It would mean more board authority, more resources, and she stopped. It would mean I'm here for a while, that I'm not going somewhere else. He heard what was underneath that, the thing she was telling him that wasn't in the formal sentence. Is that what you want? He asked. A pause. I think so, she said, which is a new experience, wanting to stay somewhere. He looked at the light on the second floor. Then stay, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, 3 more sights. Yeah. You're not going to sleep very much. I don't sleep very much now. Ethan. Her voice shifted, the controlled surface dropping a register, just slightly. Are you okay? With all of it? It's a lot of, I'm good, he said, and meant it with a precision he rarely brought to those 2 words. Not performing fine, not managing fine. Actually, specifically, in the middle of this courtyard in July, with the light correct and the structure rising, good. I'm genuinely good, she exhaled. Okay, she said. Good. The groundbreaking ceremony for Grace Harbor was held on a Saturday in early September, when the building was nearly complete and close enough to done that they could bring people onto the site and give them a real sense of the space rather than just a hard hat tour. Victoria had fought for the ceremony to be held inside the building rather than in front of it. People should see what they funded, she'd told the Sterling Capital Communications team, who had wanted an exterior shot for the press photos, and she'd won, which surprised no one who'd watched her in a meeting in the last several months. They brought in chairs. They set them up in the community space on the ground floor, the largest open room in the building, the one with the south-facing windows and the double-height ceiling that Ethan had fought for in the structural budget, and that had been worth every argument. The light came in through those windows in the late afternoon at the angle he'd calculated, and when the guests started arriving and the chairs filled and the murmur of people in a space rose to the ceiling and came back down, the room felt exactly the way he'd spent 2 years imagining it would feel. There were families there. That was Victoria's doing. She'd worked with the housing authority to invite a cohort of the women and families who were on the wait list for Grace Harbor's units, the people who would actually be moving in when the building opened in November. They came in with their children, some of them dressed up, some of them in whatever they had that was clean, all of them looking at the room with the specific expression of people who were trying to understand if this was going to be real or if it was going to be one more thing that looked promising until it wasn't. Ethan stood at the edge of the room and watched them look at it. I thought about what the building could say to the people inside it. How a room with good light and a ceiling tall enough to breathe could tell you something about your own worth. Not overtly, not in language, but in the language of space itself. You deserve more than utility. That was what Grace Harbor said, in every design decision, from the window placement to the courtyard to the carved wood details on the stairwell railing that had cost 3 weeks of argument with the budget committee and that Ethan had refused to cut. You deserve a place that was made for you, not just made. Sarah had known that. He'd been the architect who understood the theory of it, but she'd been the one who felt it as a moral fact. He'd caught up to her, he thought. It had taken losing her to finish the lesson she'd been teaching him the whole time they were together, which was a grief he carried and also, in some way, a grace. The remarks were short. Victoria spoke first, 3 minutes, specific, no corporate language, and said that Grace Harbor represented a commitment the company was making to the city it operated in, and that commitment existed because of the persistence of one architect and the integrity of a board that had been willing to examine itself. She didn't mention Graves. She didn't need to. Wallace Chen said 2 sentences. This is the right building in the right place. Congratulations to everyone who made it happen. He sat down. The room applauded. Then someone handed a shovel to Chloe. This had been Victoria's idea, which she'd raised with Ethan 2 weeks before the ceremony with the careful tentativeness of someone proposing something that mattered to her but that she was aware wasn't her call to make. She should turn the first dirt, Victoria had said. The project started with her yellow sun on the napkin. It should start with her. Ethan had looked at her for a long moment. She'll take that very seriously, he'd warned. I know, Victoria said. That's why she should do it. Chloe took the shovel with both hands and walked to the patch of interior courtyard soil, the section of the ground floor garden that the ceremony planner had staged with a mound of fresh dirt, with the gravity of a person who understood that she was doing something that counted. She was in her best dress, the blue one with the small yellow flowers, and she'd worn the plastic flower headband, which Ethan had decided not to comment on. She set the blade against the dirt, looked out at the room. Found Victoria first, then Ethan, then the row of families in their chairs who were watching her with the specific attention of people who needed this to be real. She pushed the shovel in, turned the dirt. The room applauded. She turned to her father with an expression that was trying very hard not to be as pleased with itself as it was. "Good?" she said. "Perfect," he said. She handed the shovel to someone and came and stood beside him, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him in the way she did when she was tired or content or both. He looked out at the room, at the families, at Marcus in the back row, wiping his face with the back of his hand and pretending he wasn't doing that, at Wallace Chen sitting very upright and watching the families with the expression of a man who had spent 40 years working toward rooms like this one. He looked at Victoria. She was on the other side of the room, talking to one of the mothers, a woman with two small children, one on her hip, one tugging at the hem of her jacket. And she was listening with the focused attention she brought to everything, and the mother was saying something that made Victoria look down at the child on her hip, and then she said something back that made the mother smile. Not a polished public smile, just a smile. The real kind. Victoria looked up and found him across the room. The noise between them, the guests, the families, the September light coming through the south windows, didn't make the distance feel far. It made it feel like the right distance for looking clearly at something. He held her gaze for a moment. She held his. Then the child on his mother's hip reached up and grabbed Victoria's hair, and Victoria's expression shifted to the specific startled look of someone who has just learned that small children have no respect for professional distance, and Ethan laughed out loud. Not politely, not quietly, but actually laughed. And Chloe looked up at him and then across the room and started laughing too, without even knowing why, which was the best kind of laughing. Afterward, when the ceremony had wound down and the guests had filed out and the crew was breaking down the chairs, the four of them ended up at the far end of the community space. Ethan, Chloe, Victoria, and Marcus, who had no particular reason to stay but was still there, which was very Marcus. Chloe had her shoes off, which she'd been maneuvering toward for the last hour, and was walking in her socks across the finished hardwood floor because she'd noticed it was good for sliding and was conducting a systematic evaluation of the room's slide potential. Marcus was telling her about friction coefficients with the seriousness of an engineer, which she was absorbing with apparent interest. Ethan and Victoria stood at the window. The late afternoon light was doing the thing he'd designed it to do, long and warm, coming in at the angle he'd spent months calculating, falling across the floor in the way that felt less like illumination and more like presence. He'd been right about it. He'd known he was right, but being right in calculation and standing inside the right thing were different. "It's exactly what the drawing was," she said. "Yeah." "How does that feel?" He thought about the question with the honesty it deserved. "It feels like something that started as an argument with myself is finished," he said, "like I finally said what I was trying to say." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "What was the argument?" He looked at the light. "Sarah believed that the way you build for people says something about what you think of them. That most affordable housing gets built in a way that says, 'You're lucky to have this.' And Grace Harbor was supposed to say something different." He paused. "I wasn't sure I could build something that said the things she would have said. She was better at the human part of it." "You built it," Victoria said. "We built it." She looked at him. He was already looking at her. The room was warm with the September light, and Chloe was sliding across the far end of the hardwood in her socks, while Marcus explained something about Newton's first law, and the building said what it was supposed to say. And Ethan Carter was 32 years old and tired and imperfect, and more present in his own life than he'd been in 2 years. He reached over and took her hand, not dramatically, not with a speech or a setup, just reached over and took it, the way you take someone's hand when the moment makes the argument for itself, and you finally run out of reasons to wait. She looked down at their hands, then back up at him. "Okay," she said. Just that. Quietly, with the slight unsteadiness of someone absorbing something they'd been expecting and hadn't fully prepared for anyway. "Okay," he agreed. Chloe slid past them in her socks, looked at their joined hands without breaking stride, and said, "Finally," with the withering patience of someone who had been waiting on the adults to catch up. Marcus, from across the room, said, "She said it at least 3 times in the car on the way over. I was not going to be the one to tell you." "Thank you, Marcus," Ethan said, in the tone of a man who did not actually mean thank you. "Any time," Marcus said cheerfully. The September light came through the windows the way it was designed to. The building stood around them, solid and specific, made of real materials and real decisions, designed for people who deserved more than utility. The Hill District was outside, the school 2 blocks north, the transit stop on the corner, the city going on in its entirety regardless. And inside, on the hardwood floor in her best dress and socks, Chloe Carter was figuring out how fast she could go before she had to stop, and not stopping yet. 6 weeks later, the first families moved in. Ethan was there on the first morning. Not officially, nobody had asked him to be, but he drove to the Hill District at 7 a.m. and stood across the street and watched. 3 families on the first day. A woman with 2 teenagers who carried their own boxes without being asked and moved with the efficiency of people accustomed to moving. A young mother with a 4-year-old who kept wanting to push the elevator button and was allowed to push it every single time. An older woman, 60s, alone, who stood in the entry vestibule for a long moment before she went in, just stood there, looking at the space, the light coming through the east windows at that hour, the carved wood of the stairwell railing, and then walked forward with the straightened spine of someone who had decided to believe this was real. Ethan watched her go in. He stood on the sidewalk with his hands in his jacket pockets. He thought about a rainy Tuesday in November and $3 on a bakery counter, and the particular logic of small choices, how they accumulated, how they connected, how an act done without calculation on a wet evening could pull a thread that unraveled things that needed unraveling and built things that needed building. He'd never believed in clean narratives. Life was not a story with a lesson at the end of it, but sometimes the shape of things resolved in a way that felt like meaning, not because meaning was guaranteed, but because enough people had made enough choices in the same direction. He'd made his choices. Victoria had made hers. The board had, in the end, made theirs. And the building was there, real and specific and full of light. His phone buzzed. A text from Victoria. "Are you at the site?" He smiled. "How did you know?" "Because I know you," she wrote. "Are the families moving in?" "First ones," he wrote. A pause. Then, "How does it look?" He looked at the building across the street, at the east windows catching the morning, at the entry vestibule where the older woman had stood and gathered herself and gone in. "Like what it was always supposed to be," he wrote back. Another pause, longer this time. Then, "I'm bringing Chloe to the bakery Saturday. Lena says she's been asking about the lemon cake. You're welcome to join us if you want." He stood on the Hill District sidewalk in the October morning. The city was going about itself all around him. The school bus at the corner, the coffee shop opening its door, the first light on the bridges over the Allegheny catching the sky. Pittsburgh in the fall, which was a different gray from Pittsburgh in the winter, warmer and more complicated, full of color on the edges. "I'll be there," he wrote. He put the phone in his pocket. He stood for another few minutes, just watching the building. A light came on in a second-floor window, one of the south-facing ones, the light he'd designed in. Someone settling in. Someone putting their things in a room that was theirs. He thought about what buildings said to the people inside them. What this one said. "You're not lucky to have this," it said. "This is what you deserved all along." He turned up his collar against the October air and walked back to his car. There was work to do. There were 3 more sites waiting. There was a Saturday at Lena's bakery with lemon cake, and a 9-year-old who would have opinions about everything, and a woman who had stood her ground in a room full of pressure and who was learning, slowly, that staying somewhere wasn't the same as being trapped. There was a life going on, imperfect and specific and real, held together by the accumulation of small choices made without calculation, on rainy evenings and in difficult rooms and on frozen ground in February, when the compressor broke and the rebar arrived late, and you built anyway. You built anyway. That was the whole thing, really. That was always the whole thing. Ethan Carter got in his car and drove toward it.